Hey guys, Badger here. So I finally finished episode Aigis and on Heartless difficulty no less. It was tough, and now that everything's all over, I have some thoughts on the game. Suffice to say, I had high expectations for episode Aigis to the same degree that I had for Persona 3 Reload, a legendary JRPG remaster for a modern era with some neat quality of life changes. With Reload being a remaster of Persona 3 FES, it carried with it the responsibility of being considered a definitive version of the game, more so than portable or even FES itself. As I said in my previous review of Persona 3, I was left remarkably polarized. And with that, my expectations of Persona 3 Reload being the definitive version of Persona 3 were left dashed. Instead of being unique, Persona 3 Reload is just another version of Persona 3, which, intentional or not, seems to be the niche Reload is going to occupy for the foreseeable future. The changes to the original dialogue of episode Aigis, the refusal to even attempt to make the Abyss of Time and Tartarus slightly more enjoyable, along with many other deficiencies, make Reload relatively unremarkable as a finished package that cost $105 USD to experience in full. Before I get ahead of myself even further, let me recount my experiences with Persona 3 and episode Aigis. My recollection of the answer, or I guess as we now should call it, episode Aigis, is practically nothing because I've never owned a copy of Persona 3 FES before. This expansion was exclusive to that version of the game, and now that we have the entirety of FES essentially remastered with all of its original content included in Reload, but excluding FEMC's portable content, we can finally get into my thoughts of this game. I should be clear here though, being a Persona fan and being unsure if episode Aigis was ever going to get remastered, let alone Persona 3 in the first place, I have absorbed some of this expansion through cultural osmosis before episode Aigis and Persona 3 were remastered with Reload. To be clear, my knowledge of this game is only limited to knowing the intro song to FES's OP, hearing Heartful Cry without knowing the context of where that particular song plays in episode Aigis, and people hating on Yukari for having a completely reasonable reaction to having the opportunity to see the man that she loves once again. Everything in between I somehow managed to remain spoiler-free on for several years, but that doesn't mean I'm aware that episode Aigis is a bit of a controversial expansion to some, as some of the criticism to my understanding seem to be the degrees to how far the characters regress in the expansion, as they are intended to do so to some extent or another. However, there are some fast ones being pulled here with respect to the narrative. It would seem that in some circumstances of this iteration of Persona 3, there are some issues of changing dialogue, pacing, and other problems that compound and muddy criticisms originally made towards the FES version of the answer. A while ago, I made a review where I covered Persona 3 Reload, and for the sake of argument, I will recount what I said at the time because episode Aigis is indeed an expansion upon the vanilla content here. In that video, I reviewed its efficacy as a remaster, and now with the release of episode Aigis, what will now ultimately serve as a replacement for FES's content. I still think that people are conceptually in love with what Persona 3 represents and concept, much in the way that people enjoy KOTOR 2.
It is said that the Force has a will. It has a destiny for us all. I wield it, but it uses us all, and that is abhorrent to me, because I hate the Force. I hate that it seems to have a will, that it would control us to achieve some measure of balance when countless lives are lost.
It is very obvious that fans of this game like it more for its ideas, what it represents conceptually and thematically, rather than the caliber of its writing or gameplay. I don't know anybody who particularly comes back to KOTOR 2 just to play for the comment of the gameplay, and I imagine that same thing applies to Persona 3 as well. I do like the overall theme of the game and what it's trying to say about the permanence of death, the concept of memento mori. Everything must die eventually. Persona games in general have always been super great at communicating these concepts thematically through art design alone. As strange as it might sound, subtext, stuff that you don't really plainly see, hard carries every single Persona game. My favorite example of this is in the final month of the game. The color seems to, well, leave Iwodoutai dorms and the rest of the world as the end of the world approaches. It's an incredible touch that communicates the desperation of what's going on. Persona 3 is a Greek tragedy after all, with all the personas that C has managed to wield playing a role in the Greek mythos that then serves the story of Persona 3. But that theming can't quite save her from the 1,000-ton weights dragging it down. Tartarus. Let me put it like this. There is a reason why the concept of seeking revenge, or otherwise personally punching up at your oppressors, resonates with so many people. This is why Persona 5 was so successful. It's also why Persona 5 was conducive to making a gacha game, and why Persona 3 only got a helping of EU material that is composed of visual novels and fighting games. Point being, due to the nature of Persona 3's story, necessitating that it must be self-contained to the scope of a single story, a story that is about death and sacrifice, a story that urges its characters to push on forward despite the emotional trauma that particular instance has saddled them all with, there's only so much you can do with this theme before you start to diminish the efficacy of what Persona 3 was trying to say in the first place. The only thing you can do now is branch off in a spin-off territory, where the only action a character can take as part of Persona 3's cast is to be able to reminisce upon their time in Seas with the Phantom Thieves or the Investigation Team. While it would be a delight to see them grow and change as people, example, all you can really do with Persona 3's cast is have them reflect on their experiences instead of trying to apply the lessons they've learned in the previous outing to other people who are remarkably similar to them. After the events of Persona 3, you really can't do something like Persona 3 Strikers. This is what Episode Aigis is to some extent or another. They can't really go back or return because it'll diminish the whole point to Persona 3. ATLUS' dedication in keeping the core theming and the core Persona 3 experience intact within Reload is to be lauded, but it's where they refuse to iterate or take inspiration from other ATLUS DLCs, re-releases, and other versions of previous Persona titles is where Episode Aigis starts to flounder a little bit. Episode Aigis, while still enjoyable enough to experience at least once, stands out as the weakest of the bunch here. It doesn't hold a candle to the quality I've come to expect from ATLUS, as I stand immensely frustrated with Episode Aigis. ATLUS and P Studio have shown in the past that they are able to iterate on the previous games and make improvements to the shortcomings with re-releases. I find the fact that I have to pay half the price of the original game, $35, to only get about 1/4 of the content of the vanilla game, content that is 95% dungeon splunking, instead of what Persona is good at, telling high concept stories and interacting with my party and friends, only for those elements to either be completely removed or blunted within Episode Aigis, endlessly frustrating. Episode Aigis emphasizes Persona 3's most pernicious aspects, which is insulting to the degrees that ATLUS has gone in the past to make the re-releases and reduxes of their previous releases more unique. As we play as Aigis, our new wildcard user inheriting Makoto's powers after his death, we don't get any new social links with our party members. We don't get that unique perspective where Aigis, as the new protagonist, gets to interact with our party and learn more about them, especially considering that we're stuck in a time loop trapped in new adult-high dorms. Episode Aigis fails to leverage the circumstances this season now finds himself in to any great effect besides small talk. It's incredibly disappointing. Instead, what we get is an even worse version of Tartarus, a small helping of character assassination for everybody involved, as ATLUS clumsily remasters the answer without the narrative bite that Persona 3 FS's version had. Having played Persona 5 Royal, Strikers, and a little bit of Golden, I expected Episode Aigis to take this opportunity to shore up the weaknesses of Reload and of the original game while improving and adding new content as ATLUS has done before. The best example of ATLUS overhauling a character would have to be Akechi. What was once a very confusing outline for the character became one of ATLUS' greatest triumphs. Akechi's character, at least in my opinion, wasn't given the space he needed to develop into something more laudable until Royal transformed his character into something truly remarkable as our favorite anti-hero. The same thing happened with the gameplay mechanics. Each party member's confidant got baton passed way earlier in their social links in Royal when compared to the vanilla version of the game, along with a bunch of more useful abilities to use in combat. Strikers also made incredible iterations upon the growth of each member of the fan of these too. ATLUS made a point to capitalize and acknowledge the fact that even Persona 5 had some narrative weaknesses that they need to fix. They recognized the simple fact that Haru never really got enough screen time to be a character even in Royal. So in Strikers, the spin-off sequel to Persona 5, Haru got an entire arc where she was allowed to shine in the spotlight. Makoto's sense of justice being pitted against the haggard and tired Zenkichi was an incredibly savvy way of contrasting Makoto's idealism with the harsh realities of real honest-to-God police work. The additional layer and parallels Makoto shares with Akane and Zenkichi was also super awesome as well. Best Girl On also got the time to be even more spectacular as the heart and soul of the fan of thieves by butting heads with ATLUS, and narrative parallel that shows how On herself could have become much like ATLUS if Kamoshida was left to run roughshod over On and the rest of her peers at Chujin Academy. The vanilla version of Persona 4 is a different experience to compare to how Golden is, but these things are mostly quality of life changes, such as NPCs actually having quest markers over their heads, adding indications if your social link is progressing or not, and a lot more little small quality of life things. Of course, Golden added new NPCs and social links like Marine Adachi's that add some valuable content to the game as well. These changes and improvements made these games very special. Compared to the vanilla version of Persona 3, Persona 3 Reload has been seen taking some steps to modernize the experience for quality of life reasons through pulling on stuff mostly from Persona 5 Royal, which is a good decision. Gone are the days of your party acting on their own AI, and yes, getting rid of this fast and already tedious combat system was an objectively correct thing to do. I do not give a fuck if removing it harms the creative vision or the intent of the original game or what the hell ever. Playability of any video game, especially a game like Persona 3, is paramount, and removing these barriers is important to make the experience more worthwhile. Though these improvements are on the simple side, like shifting, acting like a baton pass, which boosts your attack power slightly, the Theurgy attacks being much like the Showtime attack standing in his Reload super move, but between all that, I think the most important change of all is the fact that in vanilla, these social links are actually voiced now, which had a knock-on effect in making some social links extremely enjoyable to play through, or in Fez or in Portable, they were mostly hit or miss. We can debate on how each of these VA's performances forces a character to be interpreted in a highly specific way, but some of these generally made these characters less stale and more likable, like Yuko.
Oh, Auntie Yuko. How many times do I have to tell you? You can call me Big Sis, nothing else.
Some made for some good comedy.
I understand perfectly. I'll be back.
Some actually blew me away, like Mitsuru calling someone a Philistine on my behalf.
Get out of here, you Philistine!
What?
I don't want to see your face ever again!
Go, Mitsuru, go! See ya, buddy! and most just made me really sad. Unfortunately, this is where the significant iteration stops, and for whatever reason, Persona 3 Reload starts to regress with this version of Episode Aigis by not fully leveraging the fact that it is a remake of an extraordinarily controversial part of the Persona catalog. Now, I understand that regression is supposed to happen in the characters to some extent or another, but the omissions and downgrades made to Persona 3 Reload and Episode Aigis' combat system, level design, and certain parts of its story have left me both frustrated and very confused. Let's start with the combat and level design first. Oh boy, this is fucking awful. Episode Aigis is everything bad about Persona 3 Reload, but just made exponentially worse. Even best girl Yukari agrees by lampshading how dry and boring the environments and gameplay loop is when compared to Tartarus.
Everything looks the same in here. It's so boring. For a place so outrageous, you'd think it looked the part. I gotta spruce it up myself.
There is no room for debate here. Playing through Tartarus is like watching paint dry, but the tedium of the Abyss of Time is like painting over the first coat of paint with a different color while it's still wet and being surprised it still looks like shit. The Abyss of Time isn't helped by the fact that the design of the floors are recycled as well. It doesn't matter which layer of floor you're on. Every single time you start a new portion of the dungeon, the level design is recycled and repeated ad infinitum until you reach the bottommost floor. This is made all the more annoying when the characters seem to comment upon this repetitive level design here too in a lampshady kind of way, almost as if ATLUS is aware that yes, the Abyss of Time is supposed to be boring.
That's the second time we've beaten that one. I hope there won't be a third.
We got so far, but nothing's really changed. Wish something exciting would happen.
Our surroundings changed again. That's a sign of progress, right? I think we're nearly there. Just a little longer now. Well, I hope so at least. I don't really know if we are or anything.
Running around, seeing the same sights over again? That's what I call good exercise.
Oh, Junpei, it's called repetitive-ass gameplay, and it's boring. I understand why the repeating floors are, well, repeating floors if Episode Aigis was a DS or PSP game that required the developers to recycle assets. This is almost certainly why Tartarus was designed with Euclidean geometry or simple repeated patterns in mind, because at one point this was a PS2 game, but with Episode Aigis being a full remaster now, there is no excuse for the lack of variety, especially considering that there's now a full headroom to add useless other technical features like ray tracing. We compare this to the last floor of Tartarus and the conversation the team has there as they reflect upon the journey so far. One that's about to end as we face the inevitability of death itself as the end of the world encroaches upon us. Everyone is remarkably more animated despite the circumstances.
I will never forget this journey, nor the friends I've made.
My persona represents the strength of my heart. And from here on, my heart will never falter.
Hey, aren't we like a party of brave heroes about to throw down with the Demon King?
Just now, I finally realized I have my own way of fighting.
Once this battle is over, I wouldn't mind another trip to Yakushima with everyone.
Yeah, that'd be great. We had a lot of fun last time.
2 in harmony surpasses 1 in perfection. And with all of us together, we will be even stronger.
We should totally have a girls' night soon. We'll stay up all night snacking and chatting.
Sounds like it'll be a long night. I'll have to free up my schedule for the next day.
I don't have any proof, but we're getting close. I can feel it. Nothing can stop us now.
Comparatively, the cast of C's in Episode Aigis is stiff, even with the idea of the team dealing with the grief and handling very poorly. ATLUS also didn't change the fact that dialogue stops completely when Aigis interacts with the chest or begins a battle. Suffice to say that if there is a line of dialogue that member C's has or offers some valuable insight into the current situation, it goes right back in the deck, never to be heard again. Come to think of it, there were a couple points in my playthrough where I was so desperate for new dialogue from C's that I ended up running around in circles, kiting shadows while the team was saying something interesting. Worse still, Aigis doesn't say anything at all during these bits of traversal dialogue, which is super strange, as she did so during the vanilla content. Granted, as I said earlier, there are some bits of ambient dialogue that do play here that actually have each character remark their own emotional state or some past plot event. I say some because they are extraordinarily rare to the point where after I finish a sentence, I can make another short compilation of those very same lines of dialogue.
Honestly, I thought I was gonna die of embarrassment seeing past me. Now, how do I put it? Well, I was just doing the best I could back then.
Reliving that memory has reinforced my desire to protect others with my powers. That conviction remains. All that has changed is I now have more to protect. It is truly a precious opportunity, being able to spend time with you all like this.
Yukari-chan's been really quiet, hasn't she? I'm a bit worried about her.
Seeing my middle school self was certainly a strange experience. I tried so hard to look in control. Normally I wouldn't say this about myself, but it was rather cute.
That shadow just then was... Actually, never mind. Junpei's face was more horrifying during his first time with the Dark Owl.
The doors all had in common. The things Mitsuru-senpai knew. I need to think this all over some more.
The existence of these lines are good, but it still doesn't excuse the fact that they're implemented terribly. Whatever reason, ATLUS decided it would be a good idea to put dialogue so incredibly important to the plot, and so important to discerning why C's is so despondent to a random pile of otherwise unimportant small talk is incredibly confusing and frustrating. Now, if I were to be a little bit more charitable here, Mitsuru does have a line somewhere where she remarks about how recently she's found herself making some small talk. I would find no line in particular, but frankly, I have had enough of looking through footage of 36 hours of the same 4 or 5 environments in the abyss of time, and I'm not going to do it again to find one bit of ambient dialogue, so I have to take my word for it. Nevertheless, the angle here is that Mitsuru is trying to distract herself, but finds it hard to connect with people to have meaningful conversations with them because she's so racked with grief. Still though, that doesn't change the fact that these conversations need to happen outside of the abyss of time and not occur randomly as we're traversing the abyss. Furthermore, resigning these particular lines from Mitsuru and Yukari to random chance is outright damaging to the whole entire narrative structure of episode Aigis, and the manner to which this expansion seems absolutely allergic to letting us understand how each character is feeling after Makoto's death. Mitsuru, being Yukari's friend now, expresses her concern for Yukari's absence from the dorms, and the way Yukari has kind of withdrawn from her former friend group.
I realize this may be a bit of an awkward time and place to say this, but I'm glad you're here, Yukari. It's been too long since we've last seen each other.
You're right, Kuro-chan. I guess I haven't seen Yukari-chan in a while either.
Oh, I wasn't trying to avoid you guys or anything. I just, sorry.
There's no need to apologize. What's important is that we're together now. So let's resolve this predicament we find ourselves in, shall we?
This gives us some more insight into how the relationship has developed after the events of the journey, while the other bit of dialogue here squarely helps us understand that Yukari, by her own admission, isn't handling her grief very well.
I need to pull myself together. I just can't. I know my nerves aren't making things any easier either.
Barring that, it really does seem that you're also discouraged from taking your time to explore the dungeon floors through the threat the Reaper poses, as you're quickly ushered from combat encounter, and from floor to floor. I wouldn't be complaining so much if traversing the abyss wasn't completely devoid of character, as Yukari says. Barring Metis' new dialogue and the dynamic that she adds to the team, there's barely any new or otherwise significant dialogue that occurs in the interim outside of combat encounters between C's. 75% is just pointless small talk, 10% is C's reflecting on what that suspicious Makoto Yuki-shaped figure could mean, and 5% is reflecting further upon the memories they've seen behind the door. I can understand why everyone is a bit less extroverted given the reasons why the abyss has formed in the first place, and granted there are lines in the game where members of C's like Yukari have trouble explaining why she suddenly isolated herself from her former teammates, but by God, does it make traversing this place much more boring than Tartarus. Not that the level design is anything to write home about in episode Aigis, but between the level design, the characters not commenting upon everything enough, perhaps ATLUS is trying to say something about being trapped in a perpetual state of grief here, which I'm almost sure was the intention. However, it's still dreadfully boring being forced to traverse the same environments over and over again for about 20 hours straight. Not to say anything about the level design and theming of Persona 5's palace and Mementos because that would be unfair, but when directly compared to even Tartarus, the theming and the level design of the Abyss of Time sucks. If I was forced to pick, my favorite levels would probably be the purple environments where these monster creatures are all locked behind the bars, or failing that, the golden church-like environments, only because they look cool with the ray trace reflections and because it's an indication that you're on the last floor before the boss fight. Even the music of the Abyss of Time pales in comparison to Tartarus as well. I can't express how much I loved how on each section of Tartarus the music became more triumphant and heroic, and less spooky and unsure, reflecting the outlook of C's as they clambered up the tower. We go from harmonizing with the pianos, to messing around with the percussion section, playing on the offbeats, the hi-hats, the synthetic drums, to playing a violin, playing the leitmotif from Burn My Dread on the final floor of Tartarus before we go and end the game. It's freaking awesome. Episode Aigis does the same thing in the Abyss of Time. The music evolves as you traverse deeper into the Abyss and gets more heroic as time goes on. However, the music feels a lot less dynamic and progressive in tone here compared to how it's handled in Tartarus. The music still employs the same techniques that we saw in the vanilla game as part of the journey. A violin does come in every once in a while to try and harmonize with the piano. How the percussion is played between each floor changes up a little bit when playing on beat or on the offbeat. We do play around with synthetic drums a little bit, but there's really not enough variety here. The one thing that I will say is that during the last floor, as the score sort of builds up to a moment of triumph, all of that sort of thematic build up here is sort of yanked away as you go from an increasingly complex track to something back to basics on the final floor being that of Empyrean, to reflect the party's inner state of how grief has completely overtaken them. I also do not recognize the leitmotif the piano's trying to play, but my best guess is that it would try to be Heartful Cry or Memories of You, which would fit thematically. Still, it doesn't change my enjoyment of these tracks. Speaking of enjoying things though, Don't is one of my favorite combat tracks in the entirety of the Persona franchise. Persona's always had this penchant for making diegetic music, tracks that detail what's going on through a particular character's mind or detailing their particular emotional state. Beneath the Mask details Joker's desire to blend into society.
I'm a sharpshooter at Boss Masquerade, hiding both face and mind, all free for you to draw.
No More What Ifs details the emotional state of Akechi.
Yeah, I know I won't change anything because I can only be me. And the track that plays within Madarame's palace has the sound of a photocopier mixed in the percussion section during the refrain to give credence to the idea of Madarame being a serial plagiarist. This is one of my favorite little Easter egg things in all of Persona. It's so good. Don't basically outlines the entire story of episode Aigis and also tells us about the mental state of C's. They are so fucking tired, stricken with grief, and frankly, don't want to be back fighting shadows again here.
So far the worst, but the worst has yet to come. And I don't do this to me now, I'm cold, no. Do not make me
The grief that they're feeling is highlighted with how it borrows from the leitmotif from Burn My Dread, but this leitmotif is played extraordinarily quickly as if it was a memory that Seas doesn't really want to recall. Music has always been the strongest point of, and even within a gaming experience that's left me emotionally drained as it did, Persona still delivers on this front. I almost want to say that the earworms of the song kept me engaged in traversing and fighting, which is funny given what the lyrics are actually saying. Persona music is always really good at building to an explosive chorus, and I gotta say, landing a crit or landing a weakness on a shadow, or initiating an all-out attack when the chorus starts never gets tiring. Now, I suppose it's good enough time to talk about the combat, and how it is what you're going to be doing for 90% of Episode Aigis, for better or for worse. The combat in Episode Aigis is good and enjoyable, but only in the sense that Revenge of the Sith was the best movie in the Star Wars prequel trilogy. It's the best thing about the experience by default due to lack of serious competition, which isn't exactly the highest of praise. The Abyss of Time retains the same structure as Tartarus. There is a mid-boss and an end-floor boss, but that's not really unique enough to talk about. These don't really feel like special encounters to warrant their mid or end floor boss status. If anything, they still feel like fighting red shadows in each floor. It's kinda disappointing, really. Their impact is also depreciated by the changes to the monad doors in the Abyss of Time as well. You now have 3 doors to choose from that range with difficulty with an appropriate loot reward for each combat encounter. The leftmost one is the easiest with 1 encounter, the middle holds 2 and is medium difficulty, and the rightmost door is the hardest, where you have to fight through as an enemy in quick succession. I honestly had more fun with these optional challenge fights that require highly specific party composition. Speaking honestly here, I had more fun with these optional challenge fights than the mini-bosses themselves due to the comparative risk and reward. Going through the monad doors and completing each combat encounter often rewards you with good gear and some equipment, and some rewards as well. Completing each floor boss rewards you with some equipment, which is locked behind Twilight fragmented chests, which we'll talk about later. Granted, there are some encounters that require highly specific party composition to beat, which makes it all the more frustrating when we have to face check one of these challenge bosses in perpetuity. These optional fights are somewhat challenging, but like most things in the Abyss of Time, they quickly lose their luster. Despite the combat being somewhat enjoyable throughout the entire experience here, it's the structure of the Abyss itself that ultimately adds to the frustration to an already monotonous experience. The transition from the lightless environments of the Abyss of Time to the actual battles might offer some brief respite here. The traversal of these repetitive environments dulls my senses, as the common mechanics, particularly floor boss fights here, introduce another layer of tedium as I keep trudging on. The tactical elements behind Persona's combat encounters hasn't exactly been the draw of the games in the first place, and that is highlighted well enough with the boss fights, specifically with the Colosseo fights between your teammates here. I mentioned that some of the optional boss fights punish you for being unprepared, but in a few respects, the duo fights with Seas in the Colosseo actually do punish you for being prepared and being knowledgeable about their various weaknesses. The only exception to this rule is the fight with Junpei and Koromaru. I forgot that Junpei had high counter. I got greedy and got hit with a 20%. Oh no! Oh no! No, dude! Oh my god, no! 20%. 20%. That's all it took. 20%. This was the most enjoyable fight of the lot, at least in my opinion, but I can't say the same about the fight with Ken and Akihiko, nor the fight with Yukari and Mitsuru. Stepping into the arena with Ken and Akihiko, I knew that I had to come prepared with a persona that was immune to strike damage and lightning damage, as well as a persona that's immune to light damage and insta-kills. I didn't have the latter, so I brought along a few homunculi with me. What I didn't know was that the game didn't want me to do this. Carefully build a specialized persona that would anticipate the weaknesses for this fight. Instead, what Episode Aigis asked you to do is exploit their AI in really stupid ways instead of coming prepared to do the fight. For instance, Akihiko will use Masuku Kaja, but will use it again in perpetuity, turn after turn, if he's then subsequently debuffed with Dekaja or Masukunda. This creates a rather hilarious feedback loop of Akihiko repeatedly trying to buff himself and Metis nullifying his buffs, only for Aki to try and buff him again, and for Metis to then debuff him again. This aspect of the fight is likely to give Metis and Aigis, or more directly, you, the player, a free turn to breathe, but it's so dumb and counterintuitive. It lacks any real tactical depth that I cannot help but call it padding for an already difficult fight. Moreover, the actual applied effect here is not giving Aigis and Metis a turn to breathe, but it's rather to just waste a turn. As for Ken will almost always cast Revolution the second it expires, but will rarely use his own physical abilities. I have to assume that Ken casting Revolution is meant to make the fighting somewhat easier, even though I barely get any critical hits, even though the passive crit buffs like Ali Dance that I have on Aigis and Metis in this particular instance. To make this fight even more asinine and confusing, if you fail to debuff Ken or Akihiko's attack with Maturunda, or buff Aigis and Metis with defensive buffs like Marukunda, they will one-shot you with their own Theurgy abilities and force you to redo the entire fight from scratch. Here comes the Theurgy. I mean, if it decides to kill me, then it's over. Like, that's it. Like, what the fuck? What am I supposed to do against this?
Lampshading.
What am I supposed to do? You have to game their HP pools so you can come prepared for the specific instance when they decide to use these various abilities. They will activate their own Theurgies at specific health pool points. You have to time it at the right moment. And even then, Ken might not even be able to use this ability before you manage to kill him, forcing you to anticipate a move or an attack that he might never use in the entire fight anyway. However, what really makes this fight just absolutely abysmal is the way that it punishes you for playing the game correctly. If you rock up to the arena and you come prepared with a persona that is immune to strike, lightning, and show up with magic and attack mirrors, Akihiko will straight up spam Megidolaon through the rest of the fight and will not stop doing so for a moment. Furthermore, Akihiko or Ken will be stuck in a causal loop after the use of any kind of magical or attack mirror, as they will both settle for the rotation of Ken repeatedly casting Revolution, while Aki just spams Megidolaon literally every single turn into a round of healing items or SP. The mirror will stay active because magic mirrors do not stop almighty type damage, which would also mean that the mirrors themselves will remain active with no effort being made by the enemy team to get rid of them. Thus, the AI will get stuck into the ladder rotation of Akihiko casting Megidolaon for the rest of the fight, refusing to change any of his skills or tactics. Strangely, Ken doesn't have the abilities or programming this AI that prevents him from casting light-based moves, even when I'm wearing equipment that literally makes me immune to that type of damage, and his insta-kill abilities, but Aki is still able to cast Megidolaon here without any issues. Regardless if he gets stuck in this doomed rotation or not, the fight will always play out the same like this. Menace attacks with Akasha Arts. Ken casts Revolution. Akihiko attacks or buffs himself with Masukaja. Aigis has to cast Samara Karma heal herself for the next turn, so Menace and Aigis don't get KO'd immediately on the next turn. Then Menace either attacks or debuffs Akihiko. This is your only safe strategy here, to use these spells to fill up Aigis' 30 gauge, while Menace chips away 100 HP at a time, fishing for crits and free stats effects, being careful not to use too much HP, lest she dies from Akihiko's Megidolaon. This fight fucking blows in its entirety, because, let's be honest here, I'm absolutely being punished by the game for taking the time to come prepared before walking into the Thunderdome here. Being punished for playing the game correctly. I know Akihiko's kit, and while Megidolaon is a big surprise, I know he's primarily an electric-based attacker and has the ability to crit with God's Hand. This is no secret. So I came prepared, only for the game to have me die a death by 1,000 Megidolaons for being prepared for this fight. The same thing also happened to me with the Mitsuru and Yukari fight, where I came prepared with wind and freezing resistant type personas. I used a magic mirror once to wisely cover my bases and to give me the space to heal for one turn, which then triggered both of them to spend Megidolaon until I found myself in the Velvet Room, dead on the floor. There is no way around this bullshit fight besides using a persona like Kuryu with Samara Karm, as Aigis becomes a healing battery because Yukari is no longer the party with us. I would say that getting and grinding out a Sandalphon to level 84 is a hard requirement as well because it learns Angelic Grace. As far as I can tell, Akihiko and the rest of C's will not start spamming Megidolaon so long as you, Aigis, aren't hard countering their weaknesses. In other words, a hard requirement for the fight is not having a persona that already passively reflects or nulls lightning or physical damage. It forces you to come into the fight with your ass exposed, to leave yourself vulnerable to a specific type of damage so Akihiko doesn't throw a hissy fit and start spamming Megidolaons. Using the Sandalphon F used kind of felt like cheesing the fights. It blunted the tactical challenge of the gauntlets of fights I was expected to go through, and made episode Aigis remarkably more easy all the way to Erebus, as my ability to dodge these attacks weren't based on any kind of tactical planning, but rather random chance. It was also testing my ability to have the patience to grind out a Sandalphon in the manner that I did, as Aigis practically became invulnerable in the endgame. In order to get my ticket to the endgame, it required another 10 hours or so of grinding in the abyss of time to level up Aigis and Menace from level 74 to level 84, and that was with taking nearly every single XP Arcana card during shuffle time as well. Making personas like Kuryu or even Sandalphon hard requirements to fight Akihiko, Mitsuru, and Yukari is downright stupid. But even in this stupidity, I can see a reason why P Studio and ATLUS seem to balance it out like this to avoid making the fight so easy to cheese. In Persona 5 Royal's third to last boss fight against besides Shido's Shadow in his palace, you can exploit Shido's attack patterns in the third phase when he eventually 1v1s Joker. If you have any persona with high counters, a persona that reflects all types of physical damage, or have a stack of attack mirrors, you can inflict to get Shido to punch himself to death.
Then stay down!
Oddly enough, he also has Megidolaon in his moveset, which Shido will use to punish the protagonist if he decides to use a magic ointment and only a magic ointment, which reflects one magical attack. In other words, this reaction from Shido is key to usage of a specific item. To be fair, the Megidolaon onslaughts here does have precedent in Persona beforehand, but they're often key to the protagonist using certain items or having certain items equipped that do cause your opponent to end the fight immediately. Margaret, Persona 4's Velvet Room attendant, will also do this if you have the out opponent orb equipped as an accessory that nullifies all damage from any and all attacks, with the sole exception mighty skills, like Megidolaon, which will trigger an instant party wipe if you have this item equipped as you step into the arena to fight her. To be fair twice over here, I also assume that C's sudden ability to throw Megidolaon written temper tantrums are themselves an allusion to the unwritten rules of the Elizabeth secret boss fight that were then honored in Reload as well. If you use a magic mirror or have any other persona equipped that would otherwise absorb Elizabeth's attacks or reflect them back at her, Elizabeth will spam Diarahan and her special Megidolaon super move until you die. These mechanics have also been a trope within Persona secret boss fights since at least Persona 3. However, that does not mean they were always good tropes to have, especially considering how the expectation was for the player to blankly figure it out as they retry again and again. Much like Margaret Shido, Elizabeth does not indicate the rules of this fight through dialogue or through any kind of fair warning that you're a filthy cheater. This is something you have to figure out about the fight itself and on your own. I will also extend the same criticism to Lavenza's fight in Persona 5 as well, wherein you certainly have to know that, in addition to requiring the player to deal 5,000 damage in under 9 turns, that Lavenza herself is vulnerable to status ailments in her second and third phase, requiring each party member to deal technical damage to her on every one of her turns or land a critical hit on her. This runs counter to what the game has taught you so far through the last 200 hours or so, that many bosses and palace rows aren't vulnerable to critical hits or status effects in the first place. Failure to get with Lavenza's program and understand the hidden reasons why she's ending the fight immediately is nonsense. At least this time she has the courtesy to tell you that you aren't doing enough damage to impress her, which might set the player on the right track about what exactly you need to do. Much like for all the Velo Room attendants, there's a highly specific rotation and amount of damage you need to do in order to beat them, which is fine. They're all challenge bosses and should require special thought on how to defeat them. However, copying and pasting Elizabeth's almighty type temper tantrums onto every member of C's without explanation is stupid. Why does Yukari have Megidolaon? Excuse me? What the f- You are joking! This is a joke! Wow. These are not challenge fights in the same way that Elizabeth, Margaret, and Lavenza are. These are normal story-based fights where the stakes suddenly change and I am left in a doom struggle as Akihiko, Mitsuru, and Yukari slowly wear me down over the course of 25 minutes. I am not kidding. That is how this fight goes the second you use a magic mirror or Tetracar. At least Lavenza and Elizabeth had the courtesy not to waste my time and kill me instantly. It is so overtuned that at the time I assumed it was a bug, not intentional behavior. I'm almost certain that this made people put the game down for a while or made them give up completely. I myself almost stopped playing as well until I decided to look it up online, which honestly is a total failure on ATLUS's part. If I'm so bewildered and blindsided by fight's obtuse mechanics to the point where I then have to Google why such a thing is happening for clarification, then you have a stupid bullshit fight. I was absolutely being punished for my knowledge of the game itself, and I cannot put into words what an indescribably frustrating feeling it is that Persona 3 gets finger in my face for putting what I know to the test, which is what boss fights are for anyway. They are formal assessments of my skill and knowledge of the game. I find it incredibly hard to believe that someone signed off on making this fight a total nonsense slog that is amplified by the fact that you're likely to become prepared for each battle, causing you to then go back into the abyss and grind for more levels like I did. However, if you make the mistake of saving after everyone decides to fight each other, you'll then have to go back to grinding in the abyss for more levels with only Metis in your party, who is pretty milquetoast until she learns to resist physical damage super late in the game. Or still, it seems like ATLUS planned for this grindy eventuality as well, for players to hit the wall and head back into the abyss of time to grind some more levels, as indicated by Metis' dialogue that is present at this point in the game, wherein the party is long since disbanded.
I know this whole matter is complicated, but I'm still with you. I'll do whatever I can for you.
Okay, so the devs have planned for this as well. Enough for the boss fights for now though. How are the actual combat mechanics of episode Aigis, and how do they stack when compared to Reload's vanilla content and to other Persona games? Persona 3 Reload finally joins Persona 4 Golden and Persona 5 Royal as having character-specific special attacks similar to showtimes and follow-up attacks, but instead of such attacks triggering random combat events, or simply after landing a critical hit, Persona 3 builds its new Theurgy abilities into the combat and spelunking experience. When your character performs a specific action, it raises your Theurgy gauge, which you can then dump for a super move that ignores all resistances. This meter persists through battles as you traverse the abyss of time, so the incentive is to keep fighting and to store for emergencies is a nice touch. However, the implementation of these features came at a cost of complexity to the combat in general. With the Theurgy gauges added, ATLUS decided to get rid of technical damage and subsequently nuclear damage from Reload as well. This impacts the game in a few different ways. Burning as a status effect is no longer present, which outside of targeting weaknesses, makes fire damage, a core part of Junpei and often Aigis' kit, a worthless magical damage type on par with wind. Without using nuclear to combo into the burn damage for technical damage, it's a pointless damage type, which then makes you build Junpei into the party member who essentially just fishes for crits, builds up his Theurgy gauge, and then dumps it for a free heal when using Spring of Life. Junpei's kit, and well, anyone who uses physical attacks in general, aren't really helped by the fact that physical attacks are then segmented into 3 different types of damage instead of just one, which is mostly just done for flavor and to tangentially diversify party composition. ATLUS was probably aware of how easy it was to become OP, so they put this artificial artificial barrier in front of this type of damage, in addition to the HP penalties physical attackers like Junpei suffer. Especially considering now that after some theory crafting here, the Persona 3 Reload community has figured out that you can push the critical chance past 100%, which means that with the right build, Junpei and Makoto, or Aigis, can crit with nearly every single physical attack. I would go off about other party members as well, but this is like generally the gameplay loop of the combat here. Bash your face against enemies, fill Theurgy gauge, dump Theurgy gauge, watch, rinse, and repeat until episode Aigis is over. Never mind the intermediate perks you get in your confidant arcs in Persona 5. The manner in which Persona fusions and party compositions are handled in Reload are objectively inferior as well. One of the things I absolutely hate about the mechanics of Tartarus when compared to later dungeons in Persona 4 and Mementos in Persona 5 is how Tartarus encouraged gamers to optimize the fun out of what is the main focus of the game, dungeon spelunking, starting with how you're often pressured by the game to build your party in a highly specific way. The Persona trait system from Persona 5's fusion system is not present in Reload, making fusing, mixing, and matching different types of the same kinds of Persona and party members for different builds less interesting and rewarding. Instead, the Persona trait system is severely truncated while being tied to the Theurgy gauge, which I previously mentioned, which then in turn limits each member's seeds to highly specific unchanging niches within your party composition. Ken and Koromaru's kits are kind of strange, but their usefulness in combat depends on them taking up an entire party slot with the passive Persona traits, their foes being weak to light or dark damage, or vulnerable to insta-kills. These discrepancies left both in Ken and the Goodest Boy untouched for most of my playthroughs. Even Ken's ability to refill his SP gauge for free is dwarfed by Yukari's Persona trait. Speaking of best girl, having Yukari as a dedicated support party member is fine, but she ends up turning into a healing battery, making her utterly irreplaceable as she hogs a party slot entirely as well. She is bar none the most useful party member in the entire game due to how her Persona trait makes all healing and recovery skills basically free, which then turns into a free full Theurgy gauge for a magical nuke or a free party-wide concentrate charge based on how much she heals the party for. Mitsuru's Persona trait is next to useless as it ups the crit chance on enemies afflicted with ailments like shock, freeze, and confusion. First, this requires enemies to be vulnerable to ailments, which most bosses and mini-bosses are going to be immune to. Barring that, this ability requires Mitsuru or the rest of the party to inflict that ailment on enemy shadow in the first place, which then necessitates that Mitsuru takes up a party slot to have Marin Karn in her arsenal, or just to straight up freeze her enemies with her innate ice skills. However, even with all the freeze amps that I could muster and equip onto Mitsuru, I rarely got an enemy frozen with normal attacks, which kind of defeats the whole point. Freezing an enemy almost always results in a crit for myself. Luckily, she makes up for it with high magical damage and her learning Diamond Dust late in the game, which then ironically turned her on a one-trick pony of blowing up enemies with a single ability when equipped with items that give her auto-concentrate at the start of her turn. Still though, it defeats the point of building her around inflicting ailments if she's such a strong magical attacker. I have no real true recourse other than build her in this way because I cannot inflict ailments on every single enemy in the game, including bosses and mini-bosses. Setting aside Junpei's kit being centered around bashing his head against the enemy until he lands a crit, the most confusing and confounding one is Aigis and Makoto's. Their Persona trait gives you bonus damage to weaknesses, which is basically rewarding you for engaging with Persona 3's combat system normally, playing whack-a-mole until you find the Shadow's weaknesses while swapping between personas. It's just a blanket boost to damage, which is a very boring trait to have, considering Aigis' access to the wildcard abilities and all the personas you can fuse in the Velvet Room. Where is the variety here? Speaking of fusing personas, the bonus fusion XP system seen in Persona 5 is also gone. In Persona 5, you get an additional Persona fusion XP boost depending on the level of the arcana of the persona relative to the progress of your particular social link. In other words, say you have a persona that is able to get fused to level 25, but you have that particular arcana max that will boost that persona to level 30. This will then allow that persona to gain better stats and new skills that you otherwise would have to grind palaces and mementos for. It's an incentive beyond the perks that you already get to max out your social links, which is a very good thing. For Reload, there is no such mechanic. Whatever persona you fuse at that level is what you get, leaving you to level it up in Tartarus, which would be fine if getting gear wasn't tied to getting personas to a specific level. Persona 3 Reload also introduces these heart tier items, where either on random or specific level ups, they drop the tier. This can then be taken to the antique store to get special items. This sounds fine in practice, but it necessitates that the player has to optimize the living fuck of how you level up your personas. Because some of the higher tier gear components are otherwise locked behind leveling up certain higher tier personas, you have 4 options to go about getting these crafting items for this special gear. 1. Gaining XP through killing shadows with the persona you need to level it up. This is not optimal because only the persona equipped at the end of the battle gains XP. This gets kind of confusing, so let me explain. For instance, if your goal here is to level up Persona A, but this fight necessitates that you have to switch to Persona B for a sec to at least knock the shadows off their feet, if Persona B or your teammates accidentally deal a killing blow, like Junpei giving a crit that wipes the entire enemy team, then Persona B, not A, gets the XP at the end of the fight, even though Persona A did 90% of the work. Due to the fact that some personas' Aigis wields are purely support-based or require a few turns of inflicting random ailments or status effects to become useful than other personas, this requires party members to land the killing blows on enemies instead. This brings us to the better options and optimizations. Method 2. Bank on shuffle time and pick the additional XP option cards, or be lucky enough to get the Star, Fool, or Lover's Arcana cards during shuffle time. It's more efficient, but not the greatest option. The inner workings of how combat actually distributes XP after fights are over are still present in both this method and the previous one I listed. The only difference here between Method 1 and Method 2 is that while yes, you do get larger amounts of XP, it is still often distributed to the wrong persona, which then leads us to the third option here. You may try and gain the growth ability through fusing personas that learn this ability through inheritance. This ability allows personas to gain either 25, 50, or 100% XP points while not being equipped, but only a few personas know this ability naturally, which means that there's only a few personas who know these skills innately. Quetzalcoatl is the only persona that knows growth 3 innately upon fusion, so that limits your fusion inheritance options outside of grinding for personas who eventually learn the skill. Now, as for why I'm skipping over personas that have the growth 2 ability, well, unlike previous versions of Persona 3, within Persona 3 Reload, there are no personas that innately know growth 2. The only persona in the entirety of this game who know this skill will be Anubis when it grows from level 40 to level 44, which would be difficult to level up in the first place, as his kit only relies upon dark and light type damage or insta-kill abilities. This aspect of Anubis' kit makes him utterly worthless against boss fights. This leads us to the last and final option here. Method 4. Skill cards. This is the easiest and most efficient way to teach the growth passive skill to any number of your personas. Still, despite its ease, there are downsides to the strategy. To start, there will be a few points where you have to get rid of growth for a better skill, as it hogs up one of your 6 finite slots for attacks or passive abilities. This will cause you to get rid of the skills so other personas can inherit skills like Angelic Grace, Enduring Soul, Apt Pupil, Head Counter, or Ollie Dance. The alternative will either cause you to hoard these skill cards for the climax of the game to then use them to round out your team. Now, the best way to acquire these skill cards is through exchanging items like emeralds, onyx, and turquoise to the antique shop for skill cards. These gems are dropped by specific enemies within random encounters within a particular section of the Abyss of Time. I do not know where they spawn specifically within Episode Aigis' content, however. I suppose that this is something the player is supposed to take note of themselves, which means that the devs also intend for me to take note of where exactly I'm supposed to grind for these resources to then exchange them for skill cards. Now, say you don't want to grind for these skill cards, which is entirely reasonable. The Abyss of Time already demands way too much of my time playing through it normally, so why would I go back through any of the floors voluntarily just to grind out for one skill card? You can duplicate these skill cards by using the Vermilion clock at the entrance to the Abyss of Time. This is fine, but the fact is that duplicating skill cards requires the clock to eat up one of your valuable Twilight fragments per duplication. Much like in the vanilla content of the game, Aigis can find these scattered around the world, on certain dark floors of the Abyss of Time, or be given them as gifts from Elizabeth for completing certain requests. Though it will not change one thing. Fun fact, you can only carry 99 of these, which mean all the time I spent hoarding these things in the journey was meaningless. Only able to hold 99 of these things is an incentive to spend them, but it also makes these finite resources serve much more of a pivotal use. There are more knock-on effects to this as well, because as I've said, everything in Episode Aigis is intrinsically tied to traversing the Abyss of Time. I heavily dislike when games require investment into a finite collectible material in order to progress through story content and gain new abilities, especially when said content is randomized. I found the way that Persona 3 Reload handled its way your party members wouldn't level up with you if they weren't in your party a crime against God. Your bench party members, either waiting at the entrance of Tartarus or at the Desert of Doors, will not gain XP in parallel with the team that you're taking down into the dungeon. The fact they need to spend these viable collectible tokens at this great clock thing, which appears at random by using these Twilight fragments to level up my bench party members to the same level that I currently am, is incredibly dumb. I understand keeping the spirit of Persona 3 intact, but this has been a solved issue for RPGs for many years now, with Persona being one of them for sure. ATLUS even recognized that their previous XP distribution systems were needlessly obtuse, as they rolled this legacy component of Persona 3 and Persona 4 into rank 1 of Mishima's Confidant in Persona 5, which is mandatory and unskippable in both versions of the game. Mishima's Confidant allows bench party members to receive XP, but at a reduced rate of 70% of the normal rate for active party members. This can also be improved to a full rate of 100% as you rank Mishima up, but its presence arguably makes Persona 5's traversal and combat less tedious and more streamlined. It's a good quality of life change, which then begs the question, why didn't Reload follow suit? With Persona 3's insistence on remaining as obtuse, tedious, and as random as possible, after managing to summon the Great Clock and to officially level up your party members, you have chosen, while using the Great Clock, you must then, after the game kicks me back to the Abyss of Time's lobby, firstly, switch said party members back into the party. Secondly, I must win a battle with this party member in tow. This is how the new level gets officially locked in for the party member I just spent a valuable resource on. I have to actually go back into the dungeon and win a battle to confirm the level up. This shit is like two-factor authentication for the most annoying mechanic ever. It's
just getting in the way of my enjoyment through being needlessly obtuse. Are you sure you want to level this character up? I'm going to reiterate the fact that the appearances clock is completely random and only appears when the player uses Twilight fragments on locked chests. In my time with episode Aigis, which spanned about 35 hours or so, I only saw this thing spawn about 4 or 5 times, and it would have only been 4 if I wasn't forced to go back down for another 10 hours or so to grind up more skills to then be sufficiently prepared for the fight between Akihiko and Ken. And of these instances, I believe I've only used the clock about 3 times throughout my entire initial playthrough here. As to why I've only used it 3 times when it spawned up to 4 or 5 times, there are at least 2 instances in my playthrough where I accidentally ran past it because I was so bored with the level design and the monotony of exploring floor after floor and nothing changing.
Sister, I found it!
Oh shit, there's the clock! No! Oh my... With the appearance of the clock being exceedingly random and rare in the first place, that is in of itself dependent on myself expending finite resources to open specific chests, accidentally running past the grid clock is incredibly damning to how both XP distribution is handled in Reload and how unengaging the environment is, as I failed to make note of such an important event happening due to falling into the same mindless grindy rut that episode Aigis encourages. Due to this mechanic existing, your de facto party composition is going to be Yukari, Metis, and Junpei for nearly the entirety of the game. In other words, this mechanic for how XP and bench party members is distributed, or rather not distributed whatsoever, totally fucks up party composition. I wanted to use Ken and Koromaru for both my vanilla content and in episode Aigis, but there's no way I could have justified banking hours of my time and the finite resources required to experiment with their effect in the party. Using Yukari and sometimes Aigis as a healing battery to feed their own Theurgy gauges, while using Metis and Junpei as critical hit batteries to then fill their own Theurgy gauges, and then subsequently Yukari's Theurgy gauges, with Aigis covering everyone's weaknesses, made much more sense than bothering with any amount of experimentation here. This was the path to least resistance, and is one of the problems I have with Persona 3 and episode Aigis. It forces me to optimize the ever-living fuck out of everything that I do, rather than having fun with the party composition and then having fun with the rest of the game. Of course, splunking through the abyss of time in the system with the Twilight fragments feeds into something else exclusively in episode Aigis that harms the experience when compared to the vanilla content as well. Whereas the Twilight fragments are just used to acquire rare loot, heal your party, and level up your bench party members in the vanilla content, in episode Aigis, they're inexorably tied to the social interactions in the game as well. After each floor's mid-boss fight and final boss fight, you get access to some chests which can only be opened with Twilight fragments. Some of these chests contain items which can be used to stage social interactions with the team back at the dorms, which in itself turns into another tedious problem. The way that episode Aigis handles social interactions does not involve social links. Instead of running around the city and to talk and hang out with your party members, you're confined to your adult-tied dorms with your teammates. Due to plot reasons, you and your grief-filled teammates are stuck reliving March 31st until they get rid of the Abyss. This sounds like a great basis to save some social links. Aigis is not Makoto, and we are given a unique opportunity and perspective to bond with our teammates by playing as her instead of a former deceased leader. We can explore how everyone might think of Aigis as the new leader, or perhaps build up a conversation to how everyone is handling Makoto's death, or even how the manner in which we were trapped in the dorms, living out the same day over and over again, would be cause for some introspection here. Perhaps we could get some more insight into Yukari's anguish and disdain towards Aigis in private little moments here and there, much in the same way that we get with Yoshizawa in the 3rd semester of Persona 5. What is actually here and included within episode Aigis is nothing of the sort. We get veritable scraps of what could have been full social links where our teammates learn some basic lessons about persevering through hardship that seem completely beneath them as members of the Nyx Annihilation team. Some of these are a little bit too on the nose that literally tell you what the theme of the game is rather than having the player come around and rationalize that thing for themselves. These linked episodes are trying to be subplots to the initial experience and overall themes of what episode Aigis is trying to say as a piece of art and media, but they're way too blatant, way too overt in their messaging, and they're really just weak overall. What we get instead are linked episodes where we watch a TV show, read a book, or feed Koromaru, with the end result of everyone involved in a particular social link learning the secondary personality trait for their personas. Outside of that, nothing truly interesting happens, but the fact of the matter is I'm not entirely criticizing them for being boring. Persona 3 social links are pretty hit or miss, so this is pretty par for the course here. I am more concerned with the manner in which this addition of new and fresh story content and the way that our secondary persona abilities are locked away by what is effectively extremely rare currency. Throwing an element of randomness in a party construction and composition will forever be a shitty idea, but now players have to consider that they now have to pick between leveling up at B-team party members or spending these Twilight fragments to actually speak to your party and unlock secondary characteristics on the side. Forget all that for a second though, because
Why am I required to spend finite resources to then have social interactions with the rest of my party in a fucking Persona game? I swear to God, throughout the entirety of this DLC, it's as if Aigis doesn't know these people at all. They act like complete strangers to her because of how the Abyss of Time is the centerpiece of the experience here. I fully understand that everyone is supposed to be very, very sad and grieving over the death of a dear friend, but that doesn't mean they can't talk to each other. Every single aspect of episode Aigis feeds right back in this grindy, miserable mess that encroaches upon every single enjoyable aspect of this game to further blunt the experience for the sake of more and more hours of grindy misery. Even considering the lore the Abyss of Time presents, this doesn't make any sense either. Aigis inherited Makoto's wildcard abilities and all the bonds you share with other people. Even in Heartless difficulty, where you don't have access to the Persona Compendium, Aigis knows how to fuse all the ultimate personas of each arcana. She even knows how to fuse Orpheus Telos, which means that both the canon version of Makoto Yuki in Reload completed all the social links, and that Aigis, as the empty vessel for the wildcard, should have that same level of understanding between all of her teammates. This is what episode Aigis spends its time doing as it tries to imitate the journey instead of iterating upon it. One of our previous party members from the journey just got elevated to protagonist status, which, with episode Aigis, apart from the intricacies with the plot that happened with Metis, the game's momentum feeling is as follows. That we're playing as an entirely different character with thoughts, feelings, and emotions of their own that are entirely different to the last protagonist that we just played as. Why is ATLUS not using this opportunity to harness that narrative power? It's an entirely stripped down Persona game, which is to say, they removed all the interesting parts of Persona 3, the balancing the calendar and social events, as you, the player, have to make decisions of if and when you should go to Tartarus, take the evening to build your social points, or deepen your bonds with your friends. All of that is gone now, or has been depreciated and relocated to the gameplay. This is a microcosm of this expansion's failings, but even still it gets worse as the game doubles down. We still have to ask now, in making the main function of this game so obtuse and unenjoyable for a grand total of 25 to 30 hours, does this have further negative ramifications upon the story? My original video review of the vanilla content of Persona 3 Reload, I likened Tartarus to the spinal cord of Persona 3, where every single function of the game feeds back into scaling the tower. Everything between interacting with the party, your social links, leveling up your social stats, buying items, this all feeds back into making better personas, to thus make the climb through Tartarus a little less of a slog. Persona 3 puts all of its eggs in one basket here, as does episode Aigis. The game banks way too much on the player's enjoyment of exploring Tartarus, and if they don't want to engage with it at all, then it makes the game harder and thus less enjoyable in all aspects. It's tough to make this monolithic dungeon the central focus of the game if it is so deeply uninteresting and so unenjoyable to explore. This unenjoyment of my exploration of Tartarus then created this weird feedback loop where it actually just burned me out of most of my enjoyment of the game's story by making Tartarus its central focus. The gameplay made the storytelling exhausting for me to where I, in retrospect, think it actually lessened the impact of the major events of the story because I dreaded heading back into Tartarus once the drama subsided. Here's my Persona 3 hot take for the video. I think now with the release of episode Aigis, I can say with certainty that Shinjiro's death, however weak I thought its buildup was, as required Akihiko and Mitsuru to clumsily deliver exposition to us about how their gloomy friend we know nothing about, to then have off-screen discussions about the severity of his condition, I think I can say that his death would have hit me a lot harder if Tartarus didn't suck the life out of me as I played. I also think that the death of Mitsuru's father and Mitsuru's reaction to that event would have been more of a shock as well. In my first playthrough, I failed to consider that Mitsuru, who does her best to appear as an Amazon warrior would, stoic and deeply serious, was still a child. This gave the stakes for a fight against the Dark Hour more gravity than Shinjiro's death did not at the time, with the added intrigue to the degree that Mitsuru's family being somewhat responsible for the Dark Hour in the first place. It wasn't until the final stretch of the game I started to feel truly engaged again, but by then, I had already been drained by the grind of Tartarus. I feel most of the same about episode Aigis. We have a remarkably more despondent team due to recent events, which doesn't exactly generate the most intrigue as much as being doomed to repeat the same day over and over again should be doing. Firstly, I think we should do a quick summary of the events that transpired after the original ending of Persona 3. Nobody in Seas was aware that Makoto had died on the school roof in Aigis' lap. They just assumed he was asleep, taking a victory nap. So they took Makoto back to the dorm, put him in his bed, and then only found out that he died the next morning. This is the narrative's strong point here. Everyone is obviously reeling from Makoto's death, but yet everyone has their own ways of dealing with it. Interestingly enough, Mitsuru and Junpei are all experienced enough of dealing with death and loss at this point, so at least they haven't left the dorms yet. Or tried to avoid everyone in entirety. Never mind that for now though. Mitsuru seems to be taking it for the best, or is at least really good at holding all together despite everything. Though she does explain towards the end of the game that somewhere in her heart, her reasons for disbanding Seas and collecting everyone's evokers stem from a desire to bear her feelings, quite literally in this case. Junpei seems to understand how to deal with the loss the best out of Seas because of what happened with Chidori, which enables Demand to end up being one of the most emotionally mature members of the group as the 31st of March repeats itself in perpetuity. In the journey, the contrast between Junpei taking out his fear and angst on Makoto as the team learns the implications of the fall, compare with how Junpei realizes that if we all go back to the past now, in our current dysfunctional state, everything will absolutely become even worse than they already are. It's one of the best bits of character development that I've ever seen ATLUS write.
Hey, this whole thing is your fault. You had that thing inside you and didn't even know it. You raised it, damn it! If it weren't for you, none of this would have happened!
Junpei!
You're supposed to be special, right? Then do something about it! Guys, let's all take it down a notch, okay?
Take it down a notch? Are you kidding? If anything, we're not taking this seriously enough! We can save him from dying! Don't you want to bring him back?
Of course I want him back, but is yelling at each other like this really gonna solve anything?
This is then built upon to great effect in episode Aigis, as I think Junpei's character, unlike most of his teammates, actually benefits from the new content. We see a remarkably more mature and level-headed guy.
Oh well, I didn't exactly make a choice myself. I've been thinking, the past or the present. I don't know, I feel like that's the wrong way to look at it. And maybe the problem's us for seeing it that way.
What do you mean?
I mean, just look at us, beating each other down because we can't agree. Do we really got what it takes to go back and make an even better future? What if we end up making a worse future instead?
Okay, this tracks with Junpei.
Look, I get that we don't got much time. If we rush this fighting each other, no question we're getting a worse future.
This is Junpei. Thank you. When Junpei says that he holds no animosity towards his friends and Aigis as we fight in the Coliseum together, I totally believe him.
No hard feelings, Kay. So don't hold anything back.
I also believe Junpei's musings on the matter when he rightfully points out that if C's in this current antagonistic state goes back in time to the point where we have to fight Nyx and the fall will be in effect, if everyone is stuck squabbling over each other on how best to make a better future, or even save Makoto from his fate, Junpei realizes that it won't work in the first place, so he fights to trudge on to the future. This is a guy who's had a rough go of things between his family and seeing his lover exchange her life for his. All these experiences have informed Junpei's ideas of what true selflessness means. Even though Junpei and Koromaru don't necessarily have an opinion about going to the past or proceeding on to the future, when emotions are running high, Junpei chooses to see the bigger picture and the ramifications of being selfish, which would be vast and damning for all of humanity. The Dark Hour and the Fall will once again pose a threat to humanity in its totality, and even though we might be able to win against Nyx, Junpei is wise to be afraid. The stakes of losing after choosing to do everything over again are far too great to risk it. It is one thing to make a character a total goofball for majority of Reload's runtime, but is another thing to have him entirely retain that personality, but to also be humbled and grow into a more well-rounded and mature person as the game and narrative continues on. On that note of praise towards Junpei, there arise other issues as well, such as the narrative explanations and implications of how and why our team has been depowered over the past couple months. We started episode Aigis at level 25 across the board, with our gear and movesets being taken away from us. The explanation being is that we're either out of practice or forgot how to use certain abilities. Of course, this is entirely for balancing reasons, and is fine. I didn't expect to start this DLC blowing things up with Mitsuru and Artemisia like it did towards the end of Reload, killing Nyx before she could get an attack off. However, the fact that the party is still wooing their ultimate personas should indicate that they have not backslid on their principles. What I see is the opposite here. I do have beef with how poorly that this is explained, handled, and hand-waved as a mechanic of a video game, rather than as a narrative element with its treatment arguably harming the development of C's members rather than benefiting from it at the end of all things. The most egregious example is how Aigis just forgot how to use Orgia mode, with this being literally hand-waved away by Fuka to Aigis. This is, of course, because gameplay. Metis has Orgia mode now as a Theurgy ability, and because Aigis is now the wild card that inherited Cadenza and all of Makoto's other Theurgy abilities, she doesn't really need to use it anymore. It's kind of redundant. Still, the way the game hand-waves it away without even trying to tie it into the narrative is very silly, making episode Aigis a more tedious grind than it already is. I already have to deal with grinding through the abyss of time, but when the game asks me to suspend my disbelief for narrative reasons, that just gets kind of obnoxious. This also affects the Theurgy abilities and the secondary characteristics your party has as well, which, if you recall, were added to your party's attack repertoire after waking to their ultimate personas, or helping them overcome some personal insecurity that would do so. By not having these attacks and forgetting their Theurgy abilities, it would imply that the C's that we see in the answer forgot why they fought to save the world in the first place, which is very damaging to the overall story of Persona 3 Reload. Yukari woke to Isis upon realizing the truth of her father and strengthening her resolve to save the world. Mitsuru awakens to Artemisia after Yukari helps her overcome the grief of losing her father,
and find the resolve to fight on to stop the Dark Hour. Akihiko awakens to Caesar after Shinji's death, realizing that he needs to be less reckless and fight more with a measured approach rather than being only determined to be the strongest guy in the room. Awakening a month before the end of the world, Aigis awakens to Athena after realizing that her life is her own to direct and live as she sees fit. That she's here to live and enjoy life, even in the face of absolute annihilation. I have to say that Junpei's awakening to Trismegistus was one of the greatest in the game, and that being booked with him gaining the Blaze of Life as a new Theurgy ability, which has a fiery phantom of Chidori when the attack finishes and heals Junpei, was an incredible touch. However, this ability isn't present in the DLC for the first couple hours or so, which is just incredibly offensive and disrespectful to Junpei's growth as a character. Hack and Slash, Junpei's initial Theurgy ability, has him stumbling around like an idiot, characterizing him as a bumbling fool who is entirely unsure of himself. Comparatively, Blaze of Life has Junpei more focused. He's not running into his persona, nor is he tripping all over himself anymore because somebody's given him a reason to fight with a more measured head. Trismegistus' visual design pulls from fusion of Medea and Hermes, giving us an idea of just how much Chidori meant to Junpei as she died in his arms. When you even fight the Shadow Mako in the last 4 of the Abyss of Time, where the rest of Junpei's teammates are plain surprised that he can change their various personas, Junpei is comparatively outraged.
Athena.
Persona change? To who? Oh, he's Caesar!
I was careless.
The hell? Even Caesar? Pretty good hit.
Trismegistus. Stop it! You can't use it!
I should also note that they changed Junpei's dialogue here from Fez to reflect his new angry outlook, that someone else had the gall to use Trismegistus instead of Junpei himself.
Trismegistus? You damn copycat!
Between each version of Persona 3, there was a concerted effort here to change Junpei's dialogue to reflect his feelings towards Chidori. Trismegistus is just as much as Chidori's persona as it is Junpei's, so when someone else manages to use it instead of Junpei himself, that's just outright blasphemy. I should also highlight that Junpei is the only non-protagonist persona user that evolves via fusion instead of through a normal social link or after the character development concludes. To be clear, this feat from Junpei rivals the way Joker awoke to Setsunai from Arsene in order to defeat Yaldabaoth at the end of Persona 5. It's that significant. Junpei's awakening to Trismegistus is unique as his love is for Chidori. Any effort made to diminish this relationship between these two characters depreciates Junpei's value and significance as a character, which makes me even more annoyed at the lack of narrative explanations as to why Junpei, of all people, has seemingly forgot about what Chidori meant to him. He should have had Blaze of Life from the start at the very least. I'm gonna say the same for all the other missing second Theurgy abilities for all the other party members have been seized, but having them keep to their ultimate personas, implying they still remember why they fight, but also yoinking away the attacks that reflect this determination, leave me extremely perplexed and annoyed. All the members seized have regressed in one way or another, but we don't see that actually reflected with their various personas. It throws all the speculation about why each member's personas take the physical appearances they do right out the window. Junpei's is obviously the worst offender of this decision, seconded only by Mitsuru, and it actually does harm how they're both characterized here. Artemisia in Greek history is chronicled by Herodotus as a warrior and a renowned tactician who fought on the Persian side during the Peloponnesian War. Counter to the yes-men that Emperor Xerxes often surrounded himself by, Artemisia actually advised against Xerxes and the Persians invading Greece in the first place. She commanded many naval vessels under Xerxes' standard, which was very rare for a woman to do at the time. Women, especially in antiquity at this time, assuming battle stations that were normally occupied by men, was very significant for the time. Though the praise she received from Xerxes from afar for her valor for sinking several Greek ships at the Battle of Salamis was due to an overall misunderstanding of the tactical situation at the time, it was praised nonetheless from Xerxes of all people, a literal god emperor, or so he was rationalized to be at the time. In response to the sinking of his enemies, Xerxes then responded to these actions by stating, "My men have become women and my women men." If we interpret Xerxes as being an analog for Mitsuru's father in this story of Persona 3, then that would track as to why Artemisia is Mitsuru's persona, as well as why she's wearing half a dress and a suit of armor here. Mitsuru's family is a fairly affluent one, wherein her gender often caused others not to take her or her mission seriously, mostly because Japan bottom text, even though Mitsuru herself is a highly competent warrior. Granted, Junpei and the rest of Seas do get their secondary Theurgy abilities as they remember why they fight, but it's not given the dramatic gravitas it deserves as it was in the journey either. Instead of having something more dramatic, like in the way that the Phantom Thieves lose their costumes and the ability to defend themselves in the metaverse with their personas, a visual representation that reflects some degree of inner turmoil going on with specific characters, these abilities are reacquired through conversations, through small talk at set points in the game after we return from the Abyss of Time. When Junpei and Mitsuru reacquire the secondary Theurgy abilities, it's done in a single awkward conversation. Junpei says that he's been in an indescribable funk while Mitsuru fails to console him, but somehow this conversation reminds her of the reason as to why she woke to Artemisia and gained her second Theurgy ability in the first place. It's a game merely checking a box for gameplay reasons, but again, trying to excuse Junpei for getting Flame of Life as a result of him being in a quote funk is still nonsense. The same thing happens with the rest of the party. Yukari gets hers back after a quick chat with Ken, but still mentions that she's all torn up on the inside, but she still gets her ability back anyway. Again, it's merely artificial limit for gameplay reasons, much the same way that Junpei, Koromaru, and Mitsuru are locked out for the first few hours of the game, a weakness made clear by how much Persona 3 is actually tied to the emotional beats of the story to the new abilities for use in exploration of Tartarus and the Abyss. If this was a different game and not Persona, I'd accept this hand-waving for gameplay reasons, but, well, because this is a Persona game, I have to say that this is nonsense. Characters getting new abilities as a result of evolving, changing, and growing as people is an unchanging part of the series. If Episode Aigis is trying to say that Seize has lost sight of why they fight, and is trying to have the narrative regress in certain ways, then Episode Aigis needs to show each member working hard to regain that power again. To insinuate anything less, or to remove elements of the game, as Episode Aigis so often does, is to remove what makes a Persona game a Persona game. Sure, we can write it off as Junpei and the rest of the team being consumed by the trauma of Makoto's death, or some other thing, but Episode Aigis doesn't properly explain why this is happening to Seize in particular. Nor does it track with how most of Seize, sans maybe Yukari and Aigis, are handling the fallout of grief from Makoto's passing. This then brings us back to the main incentive for delving deep into the Abyss of Time. At the end of each section of the Abyss, there lay doors. Behind each door contains memories, often painful ones at that, of how individual Seize members started to harbor the potential to use each of their personas.
I don't mind at all. I myself requested to come along.
It's not even true! Oh. Something bad is gonna happen, isn't it? They all have the reasons, which track somewhat with how they're characterized at the start of the game. Though, again, it's not given enough dramatic gravitas when these memories are shown to the entire party. They are extraordinarily underwhelming, save for Mitsuru's awakening, and given that seeing these doors are both a culmination of gameplay and narrative investments, of bashing my head against the shadows in the Abyss of Time for several hours, I expected each cutscene to be a little less plain. From the time I was able to start going through the starting portion of the Abyss, it took me just under 7 hours to get to the door that contains Ken's memories. So, give or take, about 5 hours or so of dungeon splunking, which is a tall order that's made even taller by the fact that each layer of the Abyss gets more and more floors as you climb further down. I nearly reached the 16-hour mark when I got to Junpei's door, which is another 10 hours or so of grinding for my plot-based reward as my patience was further tested. As for my reward, through efficacy and bearing the plot waxes and wanes based on the character depicted and the commentary the party gives afterwards. Suffice to say, I really don't think we need another cutscene explaining why Ken distrusts adults. Furthermore, I don't think we need another cutscene where Yukari ponders over the ramifications of her father's letter. And while I do appreciate Mitsuru apologizing on her family's behalf for lying to Yukari for years, showing how close they've gotten as a result of the events during the journey, I don't know why a cutscene that is supposed to be based on Yukari's memory has commentary from Mitsuru instead of Yukari herself.
It would have been nice if the scene from your past could have included your father. I would have liked to meet him.
The most generous interpretation I could give of this cutscene is that it's more so about how despondent and cold Yukari has gotten, with Mitsuru reminding Yukari, as her friend, not to push herself so hard. Nevertheless, if these are indeed the points where each member of her party got their persona potential, then the events that we see occur through the doors are incompatible with that very notion. Instead, these doors should be glimpses of unresolved trauma, things that are holding Seize back from reaching the truest potential once again, thoughts, images, and words that were otherwise left unsaid to certain people. I would have liked to see more about Yukari's mother, Junpei's father, and more from Shinjiro and Ken's past. As I said in my previous video about Persona 3, I found Mitsuru, Agihiko, and Shinjiro being hard stuck in the first floor of Tartarus more interesting than the actual game, as they all vainly fought the Dark Hour together before tragedy struck. Yukari and her mother are estranged after her father's death, though by the end of the journey and with Makoto, it seemed like the relationship had the opportunity to improve before seemingly souring once again. I would have liked to see how antagonistic that relationship was. Reminding her of her father's letter doesn't really do anything, and if anything, it is kind of redundant. If you recall, there was this big arc in the game where Yukari tried to get some closure and managed to get it after being thrown for a loop, only for her to regress back after losing someone else. Another way these sequences are kind of weak is the clumsy way ATLUS has sort of integrated content from Fez and Portable here. In Persona 3 Reload, Junpei does not have a social link. What he does have are these newfangled linked episodes. But despite this being a compromise between including content from Portable to Reload, Junpei's linked episodes failed to mention at all whatsoever that his father is an alcoholic. With the release of Persona 3 Reload and with the release of Episode Aigis, this context to Junpei's character has since been rectified, albeit somewhat sloppily. Originally, this context to Junpei's character was given to the party in Portable and in Fez when Seize was deciding what to do with Ryoji. Junpei now understands as the end of the world approaches why his father preferred to drown his sorrows than face them head on. memento mori, everything must die, and so on and so forth. If that axiom is indeed true, then the inevitability of death makes life's problems a lot more difficult to endure and deal with. It's no wonder Junpei's father decided to dull his senses and pickle his brain with alcohol. Furthermore, this tells us a lot about Junpei as a character too. Behind that goofy personality is just a normal dude who's absolutely terrified and looking for a reason to live. It's also why Junpei tries to become popular at school and otherwise. He wants people to like him, so he has somewhere to belong. However, completely removing this crucial context of Junpei's character is outright unforgivable, especially considering that all these linked episodes in Persona 3 Reload are supposed to be substitutes or compromises to the original social link that was present in Portable. Just clumsily sticking it back, so divorced away from its original meaning and context, further depreciates Junpei's character than it already has been. Junpei suddenly mentioning how bad his family life is comes off as extremely hand-fisted and unnatural when Junpei eventually brings it up in episode Aigis while sitting alone at the mall. I also would have preferred to see Akihiko figure out that Junpei could use a persona once the dark hour happens, and then have Junpei tie that back to his reasons for not running away from his problems like his father does. All we get as a consolation prize is Akihiko describing how Junpei awoke to his persona, which I'm very mad that we didn't even get to see.
I had nowhere to be, so I was just chilling in the convenience store and reading magazines when the dark hour hit.
You were pretty much a sitting duck about to burst into tears.
Well, what was I supposed to do? That was the scariest damn moment of my life, man!
Speaking of Akihiko, I would have liked to see a scene with Akihiko's sister, who, if you recall, died tragically. Just a bittersweet moment that all the seers could see and finally feel as he got the unique opportunity to explore Akihiko's deep affection for his sister. Akihiko even states that the reason why he wants to push forward and not use the keys to return to the past is due to him wanting to honor the memory of his sister. Aki is arguing that the hardship made him into the fighter that he is today, but sans Shinjiro and Makoto's deaths, his sister was the first in a long line of tragedy. I would have loved to see more context for that relationship other than the way it's presented during a spat that occurs between Shinjiro and Akihiko. Maybe I am just too Persona 5 pilled here, but all in all, you'd think that when we're seeing the reasons why they woke to their personas, there would be something more substantial here, instead of it feeling like it's just a jump cut to another place in time. No special effects or lampshading occurs in these moments, which makes it seem more like a huge waste. They just seem like ordinary moments in the memories of each characters, save for Mitsuru's awakening. Speaking of Mitsuru's ironically given the most screen time and gravitas here, which I do enjoy. One of my main criticisms of the vanilla game is that the game doesn't want to touch upon the ramifications of her family experimenting on people for the sake of stopping the dark hour. I must say, as strange as it sounds, I have to admit that I found the potential intrigue the Kirijo group posed to the rest of the story much more interesting than the actual central conflict with Nyx in the shadows.
He created you?
Who exactly are you?
What's the point in telling you?
I want to know what the Kirijo group was doing with these kids and their evokers and their personas. Why are we being vague about this? This is like legitimately interesting.
We're not alone. On our own, we may be helpless, but together we can achieve the impossible. This is what you lack. In choosing solitude over bonds with others.
So a Kirijo, responsible for robbing us of our future, would dare to speak of our limit. Then again, I should have known better. This is just the kind of bigotry I would expect from the ones who labeled me a failure.
Bigotry? In this respect, I enjoyed that the expansion gave us some fantastic drama and context behind the Kirijo group through flashbacks to Mitsuru's childhood. I also enjoyed that Mitsuru's dad is no slouch here. He understands that Mitsuru will spend the best years of her life not as a normal high schooler, but as a warrior saddled with the intergenerational sin that Mitsuru herself feels like that she has to rectify. Something that Mitsuru understands from such a young age, which is something remarkable to think about as well.
That was wonderful, Miss Mitsuru. Of course, you would be the first one to awaken your potential naturally. With this, the future truly does seem bright.
Why the hell are you celebrating? Now Mitsuru will be condemned to a life of atonement. She'll spend her prime years bound to our vile legacy. And you call that bright?
Don't worry, Father. This is what I wanted. I will protect you.
If Vanilla were left with just the context that Mitsuru's intense convictions is just a result of her being in charge of Seas as its de facto leader before Makoto joins the team. Now that we see that her convictions and her desire to protect her father was something that she resolved to do ever since she was a young child. This also makes the ordeals that Mitsuru goes through within her social link even more pitiful and outrageous. She's dedicated the best years of her life as a middle schooler and as a high schooler to fighting the Dark Hour as a veritable Amazon warrior her persona is supposed to be characterized as. It's no wonder why she's often so sullen and then insulted by her would-be fiancé trying to limit her to being being a mere housewife. Mitsuru is better than that. Even though this marriage was supposed to shore up the Courageous group's abilities to fight the Dark Hour in the end of all things, being beholden to a man-child who is going to diminish the work she's done on behalf of her family and in her father's memory isn't worth sacrificing her own personal integrity, that of the Courageous group, or losing her maiden name. These are all good additions to Reload, as Episode Aigis does what any good expansion should be doing, strengthening, enlightening, and emboldening the main themes and plot of the original experience. Episode Aigis has achieved this with some characters, but as we've seen, there are things that do blunt the old experiences that prevent these changes and revisions from being particularly good. Things start to sour immediately once we approach the Colosseo fights. Holy shit! This is my least favorite part about this entire experience, because of how little it makes sense. To make a long story short, Metis explains that they have a choice to make. They could either go back in time to the past with the knowledge of Makoto's death and try and prevent it, with the stipulation that they would have to risk fighting Nyx again and risking the existence of humanity again. This fractures the party into several camps and into teams of two, starting with Yukari, as they all need to decide what to do here. Now, I could totally see Yukari wanting to go back into the past to see Makoto again, even if it means failing this time to save the world. The girl's been through way too much trauma and is deeply insecure, entirely scared about losing someone else like Makoto. Yukari being so neurotic arguably makes her the most human out of the cast. She's an incredible amount of pain, but no matter what your teammates nearly immediately come back around to her way of seeing the situation is utter nonsense. It is very difficult to believe that everyone else's reasons for fighting each other are even justifiable in the first place. Junpei teaming up with Koromaru is a situation that just involves the pairing of spares to have a cool fight. Koromaru, being a dog first and foremost, can't really explain himself, and this time around, with Aigis being unable to provide translations because we're playing as her, makes his pairing of spares make even less sense than it already does. Never mind that though, because at least Akihiko, Junpei, Yukari, and Koromaru, I guess, the motivations for fighting their teammates are at least slightly believable. Ken and Akihiko want to move on to the future is at least in line with their characters. Junpei, being kind of ambivalent, kind of tracks for his characters as well. All these different motivations for wanting to kill each other, at the very least, don't involve the complete character assassination of each member of SEES. But there are two in which I am seriously pissed about. Fuka doesn't really do or say much within Persona 3's main story, or within Episode Aigis in the first place, which I am surprisingly mad about. She was always the weakest member of SEES, narratively speaking, and is not helped by what little agency she does have in the main story is getting spent getting kidnapped or otherwise stuck in Tartarus. A similar betrayal of her agency occurs in Episode Aigis, where SEES decides to fight each other. Fuka seems to lack conviction here. She finds it hard to make the decision where she should use her key to go to the future or go back to the past to see Makoto again. What burns me up is that Akihiko essentially just makes that choice for her, telling Fuka that if she cannot just come to a decision, then she should just support Aigis and Metis in the upcoming tournament arc. Providing support for both sides?
Wait, you can't just decide that for me!
Yeah, and why is Metis just forcing this confrontation and being totally okay with it?
I won't
Come on.
help my friends hurt each other! But with your ability...
Yamagishi, go with Aigis. If you're
Okay.
wholly against the idea of us fighting, then you shouldn't be on our side.
Granted, this is a super awful situation for Fuka to be stuck within, but the issues her character faced in the main game concern the manner in which she attempted to please everybody at the expense of her own happiness. Fuka has to be dictated to by one of her teammates as she is robbed of her agency for gameplay reasons. She has to be the navigator that supports the protagonist party being composed of Aigis and Metis. It's a small issue, but are amplified by the degrees to which Episode Aigis plays the other characters' motivations for fighting each other. I reiterate, we are talking about everyone killing each other for selfish reasons, and for a team that fought together to save the world, those reasons need to be really good. So, are they? Well, no, especially Mitsuru's. While I can write out Fuka's narrative issues here and present in Episode Aigis as her being forced into a situation where she doesn't want to be within, I cannot say the same thing about Mitsuru. Mitsuru's heel face turn when she suddenly decides to back Yukari is the most absurd bit of writing in Episode Aigis. That shit made me so fucking mad.
You have a point. This matter concerns the life of a dear friend. I doubt any of us will be easily swayed. So in that case...
Dude, what the fuck?
Wait, Kirijo-senpai?
What are we doing?
I had already made my decision.
What are you...
I will stand with Yukari.
Oh, what? There's no way! No. I don't believe this shit for a second. There's no way. You better explain yourself, Mitsuru, now.
Senpai.
There's no way. I don't believe that. That's bullshit. That's nonsense. That doesn't make any sense for Mitsuru to make that decision.
We're siding with Takeba. Are you sure?
There's no fucking way. That doesn't make any sense.
All right. I guess you've got your reasons.
Are we really gonna go kill each other over this? While Yukari, Junpei, Metis, Akihiko, and Ken give their own reasons for fighting us to secure the keys, Mitsuru doesn't elaborate upon her reasons why she sides with Yukari until much later. She needed to explain herself immediately instead of being written to come off as stoic and aloof. It's bad writing to backload a significant shift in character motivations, especially when the stakes are Mitsuru killing her former teammates. Worse still, nobody questions why Mitsuru, the most senior member of SEES, someone who has fought the shadows since she was a literal child, and often went out of her way to compliment Aigis' ability to lead the team in Makoto's absence, is suddenly okay with fighting us. Even more still, why she essentially wants to kill Akihiko of all people for her own selfish gain, to which Akihiko doesn't seem to be bothered by. She is totally out of line here. This makes the manner in which she goes to bat with Yukari even worse, considering the stakes that the Abyss of Time poses to the world. If SEES does go back in time right before the final battle, the Dark Hour will become a facet of everyday life once again. Countless people will die or disappear into Tartarus every night, and the fall will become a real possibility once again. This would be a total failure and betrayal of all the responsibilities Mitsuru promised to shoulder, of everything that we'd seen Mitsuru take up the mantle of responsibility when she was just a child. Bringing the Dark Hour back is bad enough for the constitution of Mitsuru's character, but she and Yukari could also create a time loop if they cannot find a way to save Makoto from sacrificing himself. The world does get saved, but the Abyss of Time still persists, and the world will be stuck on March 31st forever. Even if we give Mitsuru the most generous of explanations regarding how she might feel guilty on behalf of Yukari, desiring to atone for her family's sins, including how the Karijo group lied to Yukari for all these years, about her father, or the degrees to which Makoto changed Mitsuru's life, saving her from an arranged marriage and a life of servitude as a housewife on a rich man-child, neither motivation tracks for her character. Additionally, the lesson Mitsuru was supposed to learn from her social link is that she needs to stop falling prey to the sense of familial obligation she has in preserving the Karijo group to continue fighting the shadows, dealing with the sins of her family. Makoto taught her how to play hardball and believe in herself, challenging the idea of inevitability of fate itself, an idea that Makoto promoted by sacrificing himself to save the world. She's always wanted to protect her family, and along with her father, only for that resolve to then get strengthened by awakening to Artemisia as she overcomes an overwhelming sense of failure and grief. I also seem to remember Yukari slapping Mitsuru over a similar situation in Kyoto, which still makes a sudden heel face turn and betrayal of Mitsuru's character even more offensive. Even if we are under the assumption that everyone is so heavily traumatized by the act of Makoto's death that they're behaving totally logically, they still are behaving to the point where they are essentially entirely different characters. Which begs the question, why even bother pitting SEES against each other if you're going to ask me to suspend my disbelief to such an extent? This gets even worse if we consider the changes in dialogue made between Reload and Fez. In Fez, Mitsuru explains that the promise she made to Makoto and to herself was to help Yukari if she ever was suffering, even if it meant setting aside her own personal feelings to shore up Yukari's. In fact, in Fez, Mitsuru says that Yukari helping her see the light once more was one of the most cherished moments of her life, which means a lot when we consider that Mitsuru has already sacrificed most of her life to stop in the Dark Hour. It was only because of Makoto and now Yukari that she began to become a bit more grounded and worldly. Partnering up with Yukari here in the Colosseo was a means for Mitsuru to pay back Yukari for slapping some sense into her. The explanation itself is adequate, but only in a vacuum. Yes, progression is the point of episode Aigis, but as it stands now, it's another betrayal of Mitsuru's character here in Reload. To add on to that notion, there is a striking similarity between the manner to which Mitsuru sets aside her own personal feelings as she goes to bat for Yukari and the manner which she nearly gives in to an arranged marriage. In Reload, there are echoes of that same sentiment from Fez, in wanting to shore up Yukari's emotions here, but it's not as overt. This is why I stood so confused at Mitsuru's explanation in Reload as opposed to Fez, now that I know the context. Instead of this conversation being contextualized as it was in Fez, being about the relationship between Yukari and Mitsuru, reciprocating each other's help, the contextual angle in the conversation in Reload has changed. Now it's about Mitsuru's promise to Makoto, the agony and regret Mitsuru feels about how she'll never be able to properly thank him before he died, and how Yukari herself slowly gave Mitsuru a reason to fight again. This squarely defines Yukari and Mitsuru's relationship as having a friendship closer than that to the rest of her teammates, as they seem to be each other's support structures now that Makoto is gone. However, unlike Fez, Mitsuru's Reload dialogue runs counter to this notion as she says that the team as a whole is there to support Yukari, and not just Mitsuru herself. When compared to Fez, Reload exchanges words like cherish for phrases like I will never forget that. It's weaker diction and language here, which makes this conversation objectively inferior. Worse still, Mitsuru seems to be explaining Yukari's feelings to the audience instead of letting the moment marinate with the audience instead. In Fez, Mitsuru poses a rhetorical question to both Yukari and the audience. What are friends for if they cannot help each other in crisis?
You have us with you. Isn't that the whole point of forming such bonds?
Of course, the added clarity Reload adds is welcome. Mitsuru going on about forming bonds is a thematic platitude that Persona has for a while, and it does get kinda tiring. It loses its panache when the main party makes the mention of forming bonds, and it's for this reason why I prefer Reload's interpretation of the scene. The line reading from Fez's version of Mitsuru sounds like she's just writing of truisms, while Reload's reading of Mitsuru lines actually has some emotional depth behind it. There's only been a few times where we heard the otherwise stoic Mitsuru on the verge of tears.
The pain of losing someone close to you is terrible. But you don't have to hold it in. And Yukari, You've kept yours locked up for too long. You've been trying so hard to push forward that you never stopped to grieve. It's all right. We're here for you. Your friends are here for you.
It's an incredible performance here, but I still have some issues with it. The comparative lack of confidence in Fez's original script and how those characters are portrayed really does show when compared to Reload. I suppose we should just get on with that subject as well. I suppose now we have to talk about Yukari's depiction in Reload's version of episode Aigis. To my understanding, Yukari herself was the source of much controversy in the original version of episode Aigis that was present in Persona 3 Fez, which I never understood and still do not understand. I think this non-controversy, as it were, is still a result of the same issues the concept the answer intends to touch upon, relating to death and grief, and also attentively requires its intended audience to have experienced total failure, death, or loss before having to play it in order to fully grasp or to otherwise understand all of its aspects, including the manner to which Yukari and her teammates are trying and failing to manage the grief. On this YouTube channel, I made a point to make fun of, highlight just how immature, illiterate, and childish the Persona fanbase can be sometimes, where it seems like they cannot handle these high concepts being explained to them as if they were adults. So it would seem that ATLUS has to simplify these concepts into something more palatable and childish. On one hand, I can also see where ATLUS is coming from. I've experienced this illiterate or otherwise loud and obnoxiously toxic side of the Persona community within my own content as well. The Persona community's response to the mere existence of the first video of my season 2 of Dichotomy of a Character, the episode where we covered on last season, their default reaction was to send me threats over Twitter, take clips of the video out of context, and get their easy licks in the private DMs, Discord chats, or on Twitter as they all punched down on me without even watching 30 seconds of the fucking video within the first few hours of its release. The mere idea of giving ATLUS's character writing the benefit of the doubt, as well as due diligence, as I challenged these preconceived notions on the thematic significance of a character Persona fans have already assassinated and flanderized within their own simple minds, certainly made some people particularly ass mad.
Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to introduce you to Brandolini's Law, or is more affectionately known as the bullshit asymmetry principle. This principle applies to internet discourse when the difficulty of debunking false, facetious, or otherwise misleading information is heavily emphasized. Now, that is to say, the amount of energy needed to refute the internet's bullshit is an order of magnitude larger than what's needed to produce it. So in practice, if we apply Brandolini's Law to Persona 5 and onto Kamiki and her critics of her visual design, then thoughtlessly claiming and then moving to convince people that a certain game company is uber sexist based on a certain way a character is designed is going to be a hell of a lot easier than digging through the subtext of the game and her character to refute those accusations. This issue could just be solved by just looking at the dialogue and playing the game. If that is too hard for you, don't play Persona, a game that is fundamentally about subtext. I identify with this character, I must then insert my own biases into the story, therefore, ATLUS is transphobic. Why?
Well, in one of the original edits of this video, I also hoped that for whatever Lover's Arcanic would be in Persona 6, would be more like An and Yukari instead of Rise. The type of character whose function is to flirt with and fawn the protagonist, remarking how cool and attractive we are almost at every single instance. I found Rise to be quite annoying in Persona 4 because of how she puts us on a pedestal, and it didn't help that her social link was just a repeat of the events lead up to her Persona awakening anyway. Yukari and An I appreciate because they have depth and, more importantly, actual agency within the plot, which helps with the constitution of the character writing. Little did I know that before Persona 6 would be released, Yukari herself would be the Lover's Arcana ATLUS would cave to changing fundamentally for the sake of some people's inability to comprehend complex themes or emotions like grief. They cannot handle a character expressing desperate grief lest they get memed to death for committing the gravest offense a female character can commit in a video game, being perceived as slightly bitchy, while Yukari herself is in fact acting in an incredibly authentic way by choosing to wear her heart on her sleeve. It's both charming and tragic the way she's characterized in this new content, and I love every second of it. Yukari was an extremely insecure and hurt person, but Makoto's death seemed to have made everything 10 times worse for her. Throughout the duration of this DLC, Yukari is in absolute shambles, and I feel so bad for her. Out of everyone, she seems the most hurt by Makoto's passing, to the point where Yukari is throwing herself at cram school to distract herself under the thin veneer of self-improvement, and is actively avoiding her former teammates as they pack up her stuff in the dorms to leave for the break. When she eventually gets trapped in the dorms with everybody, there are countless times where I found that Yukari is isolating herself from the group, which is a nice touch to illustrate how torn up she is. Where everyone is their usual self to some degree or another, Yukari, like most sane people who have played Persona 3 before, wants to get this whole dungeon splunking thing over with as fast as possible. I jest. Yukari doesn't want to be here because this place causes her immense emotional distress. It's not that she doesn't want to fight more shadows, it's just that donning the armbands again brings back nothing but bad memories and pain. The normally caring Yukari often cuts her thoughts and observations about others very short, deeming them unimportant or not worthy of elaboration because the subject will eventually always come around to being about Makoto's death. She's also unusually pragmatic and colder, having difficulty acknowledging and expressing the emotional trauma Makoto's death left on her heart to others and to herself as well. While all of our teammates have had their lives transformed in some way or another, considering that all of our teammates, save for maybe Mitsuru, Yukari was absolutely in love with Makoto in an agape type way. Placed Makoto on a pedestal, loving and idealizing him in an unconditional way. Very fitting for a video game that is basically a Greek tragedy. It gets to the point where Yukari is extremely angry at Aigis for seeing Makoto pass away in her lap, only for Yukari to get even more incensed that Aigis has inherited Makoto's persona and his powers, which, come to think of it, is unquestionably in character for Yukari as the rest of the way she acts and behaves in this expansion as well. Now, on that subject, they did change a lot of the dialogue regarding Yukari in episode Aigis, much in the same way that it was changed in the vanilla content. When compared to Fez, the short effect of these changes is that they defanged Yukari, and effectively made her into an entirely different character, which acts completely differently from her Fez interpretation. Within saying that though, the longer answer requires more cohesive explanation. To sort of ground our criticism of Yukari, we need to simply compare the ending of her social links, where Makoto gets the option to romance her. We've come to know Yukari over the course of Persona 3 Fez to be a very proud person who isn't afraid to let the people who annoy her know that they are doing so through, well, sarcasm. It is important to note that her sarcastic attitude doesn't undercut the fact that Yukari is an incredibly caring person, even though she doesn't realize the kind of impact her positive attitude and kindness has upon others until much later. However, I do believe that it is Yukari's pride that is the most interesting part of her character and her social link, as any attempt to try to get closer to her causes Yukari to either push them away or to try to keep them at a distance due to the relationship she has with her mother, one that has since soured since Yukari's father died. It is fitting that Yukari, belonging to the Lover's Arcana, seems to be afraid of intimacy and starting long-lasting relationships with others, mostly because it would open up the possibility for people to pity her and perceive her as weak. Yukari is independent and capable, mostly out of necessity due to a relationship with her mother, seeing most relationships as transactional, but it's up to Makoto to show her that it's okay to place your confidence in other people, and for them to also shore up your weaknesses. Both of these concepts involve Yukari being somewhat vulnerable in ways that she hasn't really considered before. This is what Yukari's social link often deals with, as Yukari seeks to stop this errant fear of relationships and being close to other people. In Fez, when you're given the opportunity to romance Yukari, she seems confused as to why you were helping her out of all other people. She still tries to view these relationships as transactional, but starts to understand that tightness in her chest she feels when we're around Fuka is jealousy. Yukari recognizes that this is not the correct emotional response. She doesn't want all these negative emotions to begin to cloud her relationships with other people, so she stops herself before her heart can shrink even further. Still, Yukari being jealous means that she likes this in a romantic way and has to come to terms with what that means for her. It means that, first, Yukari must place herself in a vulnerable position, which then carries with it the potential to become hurt again. When she finds out that the affection is indeed mutual, the proud Yukari stumbles over her words, blushes, and runs away because she can't handle it. It might not seem like much, but it's a victory for Yukari. She exposed herself and was finally rewarded with unconditional affection instead of simply belittling her. Reload's version of the rooftop romance scene that happens at rank 9 follows the same beats, but because the sequence is voice acted now and the dialogue has changed significantly, we now have an entirely new version of Yukari that is a far cry from her Fez iteration. Sure, Fez Yukari doesn't apologize at this point of her link for dragging Makoto along through all of her personal drama. That's just not her bag, but in Reload, she makes a point to apologize and at least attempt to put her thoughts into words. This Yukari, Reload's version, is a lot less of an abrasive person, but the solutions ATLUS has implemented to make sure players don't actively dislike her damage Yukari's character. Instead of making Yukari aloof, somewhat confident and sarcastic, giving her agency, she's remarkably afraid, nervous, and unsure of herself. It almost makes me want to say that ATLUS wanted to express just how torn up Yukari is on the inside, how much her father's death really did hurt her. She's a lot more emotional and willing to wear her heart on her sleeve to the point where it would seem like she's having trouble stifling tears instead of the outright confused embarrassment she displays in Fez. The dialogue and flavor text here even make sure to note how Yukari's voice is trembling from the prospect of placing herself in a vulnerable position as she's about to confess to Makoto. Instead of her running away all embarrassed, Yukari cries tears of joy upon finally receiving some affection. While I do think that this sequence is super sweet and well acted, Yukari does deserve all the care, love, and joy in the world based on what she's been through, of course. It strikes me as a bit too mawkish. The degrees and changes to the emotional appeals this scene possesses, as it was rewritten and performed to be more of a cathartic release for Yukari rather than an awkward confession, to which Yukari is too proud to admit her feelings. It all seems too obvious and blatant comparatively. Come to think of it, in my own first original playthrough of Persona 3 Reload, when I decided to romance Yukari and got to the point where she started crying on the roof, tears of cathartic joy, I didn't feel a sense of victory or satisfaction. If anything, I ironically felt pity due to the way that she was acted here. I am not saying that it is bad. What I am saying is that I find it kind of insulting to the emotional intelligence of the audience when stacked against Fez. When compared to the other lovers characters in Persona history, I have always admired Yukari's character in Persona 3 because of how her social link actually gives her some amount of agency as you help her navigate her various complexes. Therefore, changing anything in Yukari's link in Reload that otherwise removes her agency will comparatively depreciate her character. The best way to showcase this depreciation is to further compare Yukari's social links in Fez and in Reload. In other versions of Persona 3, Yukari during her social link gets her pocket picked. She runs back to the train station to look for her stuff and gets ambushed and harassed by some thugs. Makoto steps in to help her and beats the living snot out of said thugs. She is somewhat appreciative of the help, but is mad that Makoto didn't stay put. Yukari at this present time is under the impression that she's incredibly unreliable and weak, with Yukari herself often projecting her insecurities onto others. She doesn't want to appear helpless or useless. In Fez, when she gets annoyed at you, you have the choice to give her a hug, which will then cause her to get even angrier at you. Many players at this point were very confused because the context of dialogue choices seemed like she needs to be consoled, only for many Persona fans to fail to understand that hugging Yukari is akin to affirming her sense of being fragile and weak. A hug to Yukari here is tantamount to pitying Yukari. She's not the type of person to melt into your arms when given the slightest bit of consolation or affection. This conversation as part of Yukari's social link is a test on whether or not you've been paying attention to her social link at all. While Yukari herself is extraordinarily self-reliant and responsible, but yet also kind of cold and aloof at times. This girl has been robbed of her agency for most of her life, and instead of having the emotional intelligence to give her some space or try and cheer her up, most Persona fans were surprised to find that Yukari wasn't really able to be consoled here. This added an additional emotional complexity to her character and actually made you feel like a total idiot for making her feel weak, making things really awkward. It's actually some really smart writing that makes you stop and consider your choices carefully. While the changes made to the sequence in Reload were valid and made for coherency's sake, the changes made to possible responses you can make to Yukari being annoyed at you in the sequence change the context of why she gets mad at you. The Hug Yukari dialogue option has been changed to Makoto being a sexist asshole, which compared to the conversation in Fez, requires a lot less thought to recognize that this is dialogue that you don't want to pick.
What's that supposed to mean? So what if I'm a girl? Am I supposed to just hide behind men all my life like my mom?
It's a bit too overt for my liking, but the changes in clarity are still most welcome. Reload has also added the additional angle and dialogue here, which more closely relates the point of her social link to the source of all of her complexes, her mother. Since her husband, Yukari's father, died, Yukari's mother has thrown herself at random shallow men to fill the void. Yukari hates her mother for doing this, as Yukari, in her pursuit of finding out exactly what happened to her dad by getting closer to Mitsuru in the Kirijo group, sees her mother as running away from her father's death instead of confronting it, or at least trying to figure out how exactly he died. This then gets built on in episode Aigis, where Yukari ironically does the exact same thing as her mother, but instead of throwing herself at random dudes, Yukari throws herself at cram school and starts to avoid visiting Iwadotai dorms, even though the last day to pack up, because it brings back too many painful memories. When Yukari does find out that they can go back in time to potentially stop Makoto from dying, she caves to the idea. But Reload once again changed or removed dialogue to make Yukari even more sympathetic here. In Fez, she's a lot more aggro. She lashes out at Akihiko, Ken, and Junpei, essentially calling them all selfish cowards for not seizing the opportunity to make their lasting change here.
So, you're giving up? Are you saying you don't have the strength to face reality? After all the things we've gone through, you're just gonna throw in the towel in the fight against yourself?
Oh yeah, you're really one to be throwing around all those high-minded ideals. If you really thought something was that precious to you, you'd want to protect it no matter what. Don't you understand? We can go back and fix things. Are you seriously just gonna let a chance like this go?
I hate to say this, but I'm just too scared to do that battle over.
What's wrong with you? Are you saying you're scared to die, but it's okay if he does?
That's not what I said. I mean, have you really thought this through? Going back to before that battle means we have to fight Nyx again. Did you ever think about what might happen if we lose this time?
It's the same thing. Either way, all it means is that you're just scared. And you two are no better. All that talk about accepting the present is because when you get down to it, you only care about yourselves.
What?
How can you say that?
This is classic Yukari. Combative, abrasive, and often rejecting in the way that we've seen her do before during her social link, but it's still an entirely real reaction for someone who's been saddled with the amount of emotional trauma that she's been forced to carry for all this time.
There's no use going around and around like this. We're never gonna reach an agreement. So if no one gives in, we'll have to settle this another way. Taking the keys by force. That'll work too, right?
Her tone of voice is accusatory and cynical, but that's not the case in Reload. Reload depicts Yukari as so much more melancholic than hostile. She's so consumed by emotional trauma and unique kind of desperate hysteria, with the pain she's described as being unbearable. So she eventually tries to drop the subject on the pretense that no one seems to want to understand her feelings about Makoto.
Guys, let's all take it down a notch, okay?
Take it down a notch? Are you kidding? If anything, we're not taking this seriously enough. We can save him from dying. Don't you want to bring him back?
When compared to Fez, Yukari seems to have lost her bite in overall desperate indignation when compared to the latter version of the game.
You got to hear his last words. You even made him a promise. But here you are, still running. Why were you the one who inherited his power when you can't even make up your mind? I'm sorry, but I'm not gonna lose to someone like you.
You got to hear his last words, and now you even have his power. But you still don't know how you feel about him? The day we said our goodbyes, you were the only one who didn't show up.
In this newest version of Persona 3, the entire scene is completely different for everyone involved, not just Yukari. Akihiko and Ken are a lot more aggro in Fez than in Reload, in the same way that they removed the righteous indignation at Yukari for calling them selfish.
And you two are no better. All that talk about accepting the present is because when you get down to it, you only care about yourselves.
What?
How can you say that?
All these changes were likely done to save face for Yukari to make her more sympathetic, which I don't like. Suffice to say, I think whoever put this together, whoever signed off on changing Yukari's character to such a degree in Reload's version of Episode Aigis is a fucking coward. I know there's a general meme that's often directed at the Persona community about how people who allegedly play these games have like zero media literacy whatsoever, but now after playing Persona 3 Reload and Episode Aigis as a finished product here, I'm starting to feel like that meme is starting to encroach upon reality here for ATLUS's games, which, if that is indeed the case, that fucking sucks. It indicates a certain fear of another backlash pertaining to Yukari's characterization here, and a lack of confidence in Persona fans' ability to comprehend why Yukari is acting out of pocket here. The way that Yukari's character was completely changed and overhauled here indicates that ATLUS is deathly afraid of starting another controversy pertaining to one of their popular characters here, being that of Yukari Takuba. The end result is quite the mixed bag. Now, when compared to Fez, it's not just Yukari who gets it between the eyes here, but the rest of C's as well. Really, it's all because Yukari in Reload does not antagonize her teammates in the same way that she does in Fez. All the antagonism the members of C's displays towards each other has been surgically removed. On one hand, the new dialogue makes Ken and Akihiko's motivation for wanting to move on more understandable. Rather than Akihiko merely saying that nothing in the past was a waste, Akihiko's mindsets and opinions on the matter are elaborated upon in the Reload version of the scene, which is a good change.
If you prevented your father's death, what would happen? The people you've met, what you've gone through with them, it'd all be gone. And you wouldn't be the person you are now. It's the same for Shinji and Miki. It wouldn't erase their deaths either. Every single thing about my past is important. Because it all shaped who I am.
But that's not even...
All these are good changes. However, as has been the case with Episode Aigis thus far, any good iterations are immediately blunted by bad ideas and poor implementations of said concepts. Along with Yukari getting it between the eyes, so does Akihiko and Mitsuru's relationship as well. Fez at least had the courtesy for Akihiko to ask what the hell Mitsuru was thinking by siding with Yukari.
I'm going to stand with Yukari.
Senpai.
You're taking her side? Are you serious? I know you well enough to tell your mind's made up. Alright.
This is why during a discussion of Mitsuru's face heel turn here, I was so bewildered. It just comes out of nowhere, and Mitsuru doesn't immediately explain herself, nor do any of her teammates, especially Akihiko, question her judgment. All these changes, the removal and recontextualization of dialogue, damages the scene even further when compared to the original. Considering that everyone is eventually going to fight each other, Reload and removing the general antagonism that was on full display in the Fez version of this scene makes that part of the game much harder to sell here.
What's wrong with you? Are you saying you're scared to die, but it's okay if he does?
That's not what I said. I mean, have you really thought this through?
So with all antagonism and malice taken out of the conversation with C's here, how exactly does Persona 3 Reload urge each member of C's to go ahead and fight each other? In Reload, Yukari tells C's to consider how they all felt about Makoto, and to allow those feelings to guide them to their choices, regarding if they want to move on with their lives or go back to the past.
I made my feelings clear. Now you... No. Now everyone needs to recognize their own feelings. Think about who he was and what he meant to us.
Comparatively, it feels like wishy-washy platitudinal nonsense, even more so than Fez's version did. I think that's partly due to Yukari's usage of the word us, which is especially strange here. That word, when used in context here, has connotations of togetherness when that's not what's happening here. Seas is currently self-destructing and everyone's about to fight each other. The word choice here sucks, but of course, things do get worse. This is where the coup de grace happens that really put the final nail in the coffin for me regarding episode Aigis' new content here. The most damaging part of these changes to the narrative and Yukari's character are the changes made after Fuka, Menace, and Aigis win. In Fez, Yukari is still bluffing and otherwise projecting, refusing to acknowledge how hard she's still hurting on the inside. Her tone in the scene is still cynical and accusatory. She even tries to steal the key back from Aigis, but still being stuck in the 6th stage of grief here, that of testing. When Menace tells her that only Aigis can use that key, Yukari finally gives up and collapses, letting it all finally spill out.
That was a nice speech back there, but you still haven't made a real decision, huh? Then give it to me! Give me that key!
Yukari-chan! It's no use. Only my sister can use the true key now.
I want to see him.
She also spells out the reasons why she hates Aigis for inheriting Makoto's power and how ultimately she's failed to uphold that promise. The fall nearly happened because people individually wished for death, which mixed with Grant and Moss, thus dooming all of humanity. Yukari, as far as Fez is concerned, has failed to uphold the bargain and thinks herself to be a weak hypocrite. More importantly, this dialogue highlights the difference between the promise she made to Makoto and the one Aigis made to Makoto. Aigis wished to protect Makoto, while Yukari wanted to be strong and change the world so people would cease being so nihilistic. More importantly, Yukari says this describes the sincerity of her promise and what that meant if she failed.
I made a promise to him too. I promised that I'd try my best to change this world so that people would stop wishing for the fall. It wasn't like yours. It was something I promised myself while holding his cold hand.
This is an incredible line. Aigis had the privilege of seeing Makoto off as he died in her lap, while Yukari had to make the promise to a cold, dead corpse that could no longer hear her. It's a promise seemingly made in vain. It's a fantastic moment of growth for Yukari as she finally comes over the hill of grief. And I cannot for the life of me imagine why the fuck ATLUS decided to change it in Reload. This is the most offensive crime this DLC commits. The scene where Cease finally crests over the proverbial hill of grief and begins to accept that Makoto is gone. The first thing they decide to remove in Reload's version of the scene is Yukari trying to yoink the key from Aigis and then subsequently collapsing out of hopeless despair. Yes, that aspect of the scene is completely absent, ripped out root and stem. What replaced this scene and Yukari's anguish in Persona 3 Reload is a downgrade that I must admit, due to its goofy pacing and posing, made me laugh.
Yeah, so... really don't want to go back?
The way Yukari goes, yeah, so, and just collapses to the floor with her head in her hands without any real elaboration, as Living with Determination plays in the background, was really funny at the time. Needless to say, this is not the reaction you wanted from me or anyone else, and it all stems from poor posing and bad pacing. The build to Yukari's acceptance of her grief in Fez was well paced and contextualized extraordinarily well with how aggro she was towards everyone else. However, comparatively in Reload, there is no dramatic build up here. This is largely due in part to how different this Yukari is to the Fez version. In Reload, there's no animosity present between any member of Seeds, which, of course, negatively impacts the scene, but more to the point about Yukari, the way she's characterized in Reload sounds like every single time she opens her mouth and speaks, it sounds like that she's about to cry.
Take it down a notch? Are you kidding? If anything, we're not taking this seriously enough. We can save him from dying. Don't you want to bring him back? This is different. We might be able to change something. We can't pass that up. That's not what I said. We can actually change the past. What's wrong with wanting that?
Characterizing Yukari as barely keeping herself together is fine, but Reload has to make good on her desperation.
Reload's removal about Yukari clutching Makoto's cold dead hand does this notion no favors, and neither does changing the meaning of her promise to Makoto. In Fez, Yukari says that her promise wasn't like Aigis's, implying that even while Yukari's promise would ultimately fall on deaf ears, it's different enough from Aigis's vow to protect Makoto. Context matters here. Conversely, unlike Fez, Reload's version of Yukari doesn't try to differentiate her promise from Aigis's. She says the promise that she made to Makoto to stop the fall from ever happening wasn't really a promise she made to Makoto's body, as much as it was a promise to herself and only herself.
I made him a promise too. I told him I'd do my best to change this world. People would stop wishing for the fall. That's why I wanted to move on from the past and just focus on the future.
It would seem whoever rewrote this scene took the myself part in the original dialogue and decided to make it the subject of Yukari's motivations instead of the predicate. In the original Fez dialogue, the word myself absolutely doesn't have the connotations of Yukari making a solemn vow to herself and only herself to improve as it is presented within Reload's version. Rather, it has connotations of loneliness, anguish, despair, and grief, with her promise to Makoto being unique in character and different enough from Aigis's to mention. The usage of the word myself also has different uses based on the context when used informally. It can be used reflexively or for emphasis. It's very clear that Yukari is written to be doing almost both at the same time here, as to highlight the unique nature of her promise to Makoto and how she was utterly alone in the circumstances in which that promise was generated. Yukari is making the promise to herself in the presence of a dead person. Indeed, this is technically true, but the removal of the line regarding Yukari being there to feel Makoto's cold, dead hands and the imagery such language provides to supplement Yukari's anguish is what makes the original scene in Fez so good. So, in other words, as the scene now stands in Reload's version, Yukari's promise no longer implicates the love Yukari had for Makoto. I fucking hate this. I want to say that it's a push to make and elevate Aigis's bond to Makoto more unique than the rest of the party, and if that is the intention, then it's not really necessary. In fact, it is kind of redundant. Aigis is the reason why this whole thing with Nyx gets started in the first place. Now, I do not engage in stupid shipping wars, but it is and should be possible for a character to have an unrequited love for another, especially when we literally see Yukari cry out to Makoto as he flies away to the moon to burn his dread at the end of the game. At the time, I thought they were setting up something special here before episode Aigis was even a glimmer in our eyes, but instead, ATLUS chose a more ambivalent path for Yukari. Never mind that though, the changes in dialogue here seem to place the blame for Yukari and the rest of C's reasons for fighting each other as just excuses and personal failures. They're not driven to fight each other out of anger and indignation, as was the case in Fez, where all the fights in the Coliseum were a set of emotionally charged series of fights, where Yukari was arguably stoking the flames, setting the stage for something so incomprehensible to even consider to be happening in the first place to be somewhat plausible instead. Alright, now to be fair to the rest of the scene, at least the dregs of what remains from Fez's version is well acted, and this depiction of Yukari is at least in line with the rest of Reload's mood. This Yukari is one who expresses her grief with a degree of desperate melancholy and sadness, as opposed to outright lashing out at her teammates in anger.
It's hard. Unbearably hard. But if you don't face that pain, it will never heal.
So what? If I face it, it'll suddenly be okay? I'll just accept that he's gone? Or forget all about it? That won't happen! All of us should know by now. That never happens!
You've been trying so hard to push forward that you never stop to grieve. It's all right. We're here for you. Your friends are here for you.
I think out of everything, the voice acting here redeems the scene much like an enhanced Reload social links. I think it's the only thing that prevents this whole scene from becoming totally devoid of all character, because at least Mitsuru and Yukari's VAs are trying their best to sell the scene to me. And granted, without the comparisons I made from Fez, it would have totally sold me. I still prefer Fez's depiction in its entirety, and I don't think anything can really top this incredibly human depiction of grief coming from Yukari, especially considering how it's resolved. Speaking of resolving to do better, despite the abysmal tragedy this expansion can be sometimes, believe it or not, there are some things I actually enjoyed about episode Aigis Reload. Its most solid and least divisive aspects involve Aigis and Metis, whom I thoroughly enjoyed spending my time with. I wish Metis had a social link, as it would provide a unique opportunity for Aigis to effectively talk to herself. herself. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, so let's just back it up again. To contextualize everything real quick, after journeying with Makoto and Seas, Aigis had learned what it means to be human and to have something to fight for. An aspect of her character that I love seeing reflected was the change in her voice acting that occurs throughout the game as she transformed from being something less robotic.
I intend to synchronize my schedule with everyone for maximum efficiency. If I remain here on standby, it could affect our deployment efficiency.
Being really unintentionally funny with that fish out of water outlook that she has.
In this scene, the main character says, "That ass better not crack under pressure." Usually, people's asses are already cracked. Yours is as well, right? Shake. Is shake the command given to request pause on one's head? I comprehend.
To something more human, as Aigis understands what the human experience is like for, well, someone basically immortal, a robot.
It's sad to think about, but you and I will have to part one day as well. And then, I'll never be able to see you again. There are so many things in life I don't understand. It's filled with so much pain. You meet others, forge relationships, and spend time with them. And then they're gone, leaving you behind, leaving you alone. When I think about that, I just can't hold back my feelings. But I understand now. That's just how it is.
Though, in learning more about the human experience and forming connections and bonds with other people, Aigis has also developed the ability to have nightmares. She cannot sleep as she's racked with the guilt of failing her mission to protect Makoto, but is more so concerned by the fact that she didn't realize it happened. His death seems so random. Why him of all places at this time? This grief literally tore Aigis apart to the point where she wanted to jettison or replace the parts of her that grew to be human. Perhaps Aigis wanted to be in a state of disrepair or even to die, as she had failed in her mission to protect Makoto, a nightmare that replayed within Aigis' mind every single night. Aigis was so inconsolable, so depressed and racked with guilt, that the only thing Aigis thought prudent to do was become an unthinking and unfeeling machine again.
If this is what it's like now, then I wish I could just be a simple machine again.
This was how our newest party member, Metis, came into being, and how Aigis was able to use the wildcard ability in Makoto's stead. And I gotta say, this was really cool. I love this so much. Oh, god damn it. Oh, that's cool. Okay, I see where this is going.
That was...
Okay. That's fucking cool. That's awesome. I love that. Okay. Metis is Aigis' shadow. In keeping up with the implications of Metis being Aigis' shadow, this is also how Aigis was able to wield the wild card in Makoto's stead. Aigis was so filled with emptiness that she herself became a blank slate, being able to use literally any arcana she wanted as a new wild card wielder. Aigis literally jettisoned all the human emotion out of her to create an entirely different person. That's how bad things were for Aigis. Another layer to this is our newest party member, Metis. She represents a few different things to me in Persona 3. Firstly, as a new character, I thoroughly enjoy Metis' company. I think she's, well, adorable. I really liked her awkward fish out of water interactions with the rest of the team, as she provided some much needed comedic relief on account of the man maturing somewhat.
How about you quit it with the silent treatment and say something?
Is she asleep?
Huh?
Oh, she's trying on the uniform.
Apologies for the wait. Oh, I mean... Sorry, did I keep you waiting?
What the fuck are you doing, Metis?
Sisters, enemies, go splat and die, please!
Though originally, I thought this game was being a bit heavy-handed with the manner in which she knows a little too much about the Abyss of Time, the additional story context that's given towards the end of the story makes her presence much more conducive to what episode Aigis is trying to say about grief. On top of that very notion, there's the lore implications of who and what kind of entity Metis is when compared to the other party members. Episode Aigis is when ATLUS really started leaning into the young and psychological aspect of Persona once again, with the shadow, the true self, and your ideal self that would then be heavily featured in Persona 4 and 5, with Metis adding onto the lore of the series, with Metis further defining what you can and cannot do with these concepts. To my understanding, Metis was the first character in Persona history to introduce the idea of shadows and personas being the same exact thing, which would explain how C's, the investigation team, and the Phantom Thieves managed to wrangle and then wield their personas. Awakening and wielding the power of persona involves a certain desire to achieve a specific goal that lines up with what your own inner desires want, albeit suppressed by either a personal fear or societal expectations. In the case of Persona 5, it had to do with feeding your own inner desire to rebel against society while remaining true to yourself despite society insisting otherwise. For Persona 4, it had to do with accepting parts of yourself that members of the investigation team would rather not acknowledge about themselves. For Persona 3, it had to do with each member sees his commitment to face death and persist in the face of total oblivion, which is why Yukari has trouble summoning Ayo at the start of the game. This new tidbit of lore also expands upon the reasons why members of C's like Mitsuru awaken their powers naturally and without issues, while those who the Courageous group experimented upon, like Chidori and Shinjiro, who had artificial personas, or really shadows in this context, which would periodically go berserk and try and kill their wielders. Medea is more Chidori's shadow rather than her persona, and Medea likely tries to kill Chidori because Chidori still has some personal hangups that prevent her from wielding Medea in earnest. Metis, in another sense, also represents something unique about shadows and personas that ATLUS hasn't really revisited in mainline games. As we find out, the reason why Metis is so knowledgeable about the mechanics of the Abyss of Time is that she is indeed Aigis' shadow. That's right, Metis is Aigis' shadow self.
Sister?
Who the fuck is
Call me that. You're not my sister.
Oh, she said the words! Oh no! She's not hostile or distorted in the ways that other shadows were depicted in Persona 4 and 5. At least after the fact, she tries to kill the entire party to spare Aigis. Metis, in being the shadow of a robot, represents the concept of Aigis' capacity to comprehend, feel, and understand human emotions. A literal part of the human experience Aigis herself wanted to get rid of to stop feeling the pain of Makoto's death. In other words, Metis is literally human emotion itself, given its own individual ego and form due to how intensely and purely Aigis cared for Makoto. Metis, being Aigis' own emotion, inherits her childlike emotional intelligence because, for Aigis, she recently became more human herself, which would then also explain her childlike aloof fish out of water manner of how she stumbles through conversations as well. More importantly, she retains the degree to which Metis is deathly afraid of being abandoned, which is why she insists on calling her Aigis sister. This may also explain why Metis is so overprotective of Aigis in particular. I would say that's a sort of emotional subdivision of Aigis' inherent instinct to protect Makoto. There's also that lovely bit of subtext Persona is so well for. Metis' persona is Psyche, which in Greek refers to someone's soul, mind, spirit, or more literally, the invisible animating entity which occupies the physical body. In Greek mythology, Psyche's beauty was the subject of much jealousy for Aphrodite, who then put her on many trials, including a trip to the underworld before she was shortly then married to Eros. There's a lot to say about how the emotions Aigis jettisoned from her own heart would then be the basis for humanity's understanding of emotions, be ground zero for the degrees and types of love humanity would experience throughout their lives. Aigis, who started off very unhuman-like, like a machine, like a robot, slowly picked up on aspects of the human experience, including love, death, and suffering along the way while she was journeying with C's in the vanilla portion of the game. If Aigis didn't have a soul when she was first created, she has one now. Think about that for a second. Aigis' own psyche, as it were, the part of a soul that will eventually become Metis. The fact that in Greek mythology, Eros is not only a god, but a type of love of the sexual kind might clue us into how Aigis may have felt about Makoto before he died. Additionally, both Eros and Psyche did have a daughter. They had a daughter named Hedone, which is the personification of the goddess of pleasure, enjoyment, and delight, which would make sense as a daughter born from the union of Eros and Psyche. For reference, Hedone is where we get the word hedonism from. Now, hedonism, as far as thinkers like Aristotle are concerned, differs from our perceptions of the concept today, having to do with relentless pursuit of pleasure. Aristotle asserts that hedonism is not only one's capacity to seek pleasure, but also one's ability to endure pain. It's a test of one's faith, their emotional intelligence, and the ability to remain virtuous or otherwise stoic under duress. Of course, these are all skill checks that Aigis has otherwise failed. The way that she cared for Makoto was too much for her to bear. Aigis essentially not only jettisoned her love for Makoto, but also her very soul, in an attempt to not feel anything anymore, which created an entirely different entity, a different person. On top of that, Metis in Greek mythology is an actual goddess, a titan to be more specific, which was in itself the deification of good counsel, planning, cunning, and wisdom. This tracks with how Metis guides us around the Abyss of Time, and often has the wisdom and understanding of the mechanics of the Abyss of Time to answer all of our questions about this weird place. On top of that, within Greek mythology, Metis was also Athena's mother. Knowing that Athena is Aigis' persona, the connection becomes clear. This is why I love Persona, and the fact that the final boss of episode Aigis basically includes several minor Greco-Roman gods trying to preserve Orpheus' lover, which, as the tale goes, isn't just one person, but all the positive aspects of the human experience itself. Orpheus dies in the Greek mythos to preserve even the concept of death from being corrupted by the worst aspects of humanity by Erebus, who is not a god itself, but rather a formless primordial concept of total darkness. Subtext really does carry Persona. Subtext itself is enough to satisfy nerds like me. But despite all the interest the lore itself generates, it's not enough to save Erebus from being an extraordinarily boring final boss fight. In a franchise that has some memorable boss fights, I now understand why Erebus wasn't talked about as much as any of other Persona 4's boss fights or even Persona 5's. Even when compared to some of its pure boss fights in Persona 3, like the fights with the Shadows, Strega, and Nyx, it comparatively sucks. The music in Persona games is always incredible and thematically appropriate. Even getting to Nyx felt like an achievement of itself despite the arduous grind. The fact that it's a 13-phase boss fight makes it a formidable fight and thematically important as Nyx runs through all the various arcanas. Aria of the Soul being mixed in with Battle for Everyone's Souls, Nyx's battle theme here, as her team fights to save the world from ruin, is one of the most hype feelings I've ever felt in any video game I've ever played. Persona 5 then capitalized on all this by tying all the various musical leitmotifs present in the game, from the refrains of Yaldabaoth's boss theme to the bright and hopeful Sword in My Bones, which plays when teammates swag into the second Personas. This leitmotif then evolves to then turn triumphant when Joker manages to summon Setsunai to shoot God in the head. It is also used in the new layer Mementos that crops up as the result of the events that bring about the third semester content in Royal. Comparatively, Erebus' theme is boring. It's got a slight groove to it, but other than that, it's not too special. If I were forced to say why I like it, it's got this early 2000s J-rock sound to it, and that's really about it. While the tactical element of Persona combat isn't the most engaging part of any of the games, Erebus' reliance on his screen clear almighty type instant kill ability isn't an interesting enough mechanic. In fact, I think it's kinda lame. What makes it even more laughable is that if you have a Persona with the Endure ability, you can just ignore this attack rather than work to cancel it. Shit. Oh.
Multiple team members are out of commission.
Aigis survived? If you're gonna tell me that this guy is supposed to be an amalgamation of every single negative emotion in all of human history and just have it be a boss fight that is incomparable to Nyx, then I don't really know how to take this guy seriously. Apart from that, its immunity to all magical types of damage during certain phases forces you to bring along Junpei and Metis, which then means Aigis and Yukari have to serve as healing batteries, so Erebus doesn't immediately one-shot you due to the HP penalties for physical attacks. It basically just turns into a giant slugfest, which goes on for far too long, and it's entirely unenjoyable. It's not a good fight by any metric, even when compared to the fight with our teammates or with the shadow on the face of Stannis Barrett, Makoto Yuki. The latter fight was probably my favorite in the game. I always enjoy when certain things are inverted, like when you fight certain protagonists from previous games or old party members who have grown old and grizzled. Even though this fight is fairly easy, this fight oozes that style and much more, which is something that I can't really say about episode Aigis in its totality.
As a Persona fan, I am glad to have finally played Episode Aigis. While I still got all the warm fuzzy feelings of all of our teammates resolving to do better to honor Makoto's sacrifice, Mitsuru telling everyone to keep their invokers instead of hiding them away, Yukari offering her friendship back to Aigis herself wanting to return to school to graduate with the second years on her team, and the thematic significance of Aigis locking up Irodotai dorms, seemingly for good, as Brand New Days plays in the background as a credits roll. I wish I enjoyed the experience a lot more than I did. There are far too many instances of episode Aigis asking me to suspend my disbelief for various nonsensical reasons, both regarding the gameplay and the story. As a remaster of Persona 3 FES, this whole experience that just went over now is the only way to really experience the answer with an original copy of Persona 3 FES, and for better or for worse, it has some issues with its efficacy as a remaster. It takes far too many creative liberties with the matter it often changes dialogue without providing enough substance to justify such an action, then often leads to some confusing situations. The gameplay experience is somehow worse than exploring Tartarus. It's just as stale, tedious, and boring. And the manner to which ATLUS seemed to double down on what made that experience so tedious in the first place made it a confusing choice when they had the chance to make traversing the space so much more enjoyable with a remaster. It was a mistake to both make this expansion as long as it was, and to make every single aspect of this game feed back into traversing the abyss. In total, it took me about 32 hours to complete this expansion on Heartless difficulty, and I don't know if I will be back to play it again, which is something I can't really say about the vanilla content. Though I am glad I played Episode Aigis at least once, I really wanted to love it. However, in the end of all things, it really was the ultimate mixed bag. Offensive and indecisive. As a Persona fan, I would only recommend playing through it once, but if I wasn't, I'm not sure if I would recommend this at all. Perhaps I will revisit in the future, as it would for the vanilla content here, but now I suppose it's time to do what Seas does and think to the future. Brand new days are ahead. Anyway guys, this has been X, and I'm gonna thank you all for watching. I've been missing for a while again, but now I think I've hit my stride at this point in my life where I think I have some more free time to make videos once again. I still owe you all several dichotomy of a character videos, and despite my absence, I have been picking away at them while I've been gone. I have no timetable yet, and I know I've tested your patience, but I have to ask you to wait some more. In the meantime, watch those sub boxes and hit that subscribe button if you haven't done so already. I'm out of here, and goodbye for now.
Without you.